Let's go ahead and start then. Want to welcome everybody to the Apalachicola Bay System Initiative Community Advisory Board meeting of July 16th, 2020. What I'd like to do first is kind of just briefly review a few procedural things, primarily related to working in the virtual world. Just be aware of background noise and how it does, interfere. It gets projected and amplified, and it makes it difficult to hear. It really helps a lot if folks keep themselves muted, except when speaking. So on the Zoom platform, there's a microphone icon, and when it's green, you're lit up, and when it's red, that you're muted. All you have to do is press that. But if you just want to speak for just a second, you can hold down your space bar, and as long as you're holding down the space bar, you'll be unmuted. So that's a way of, like to say responding to roll call, that you don't actually have to hit your icon to do that. Please say your name each time you speak, just so it helps everybody, because even though we have some pictures, it's hard to get everybody on the screen at the same time. So you just say, hey, this is so-and-so. Please wait till you're called on to speak. I will stack names, and everybody will have an opportunity. All our members will have an opportunity to speak. Other members of the public will have an opportunity to speak during public comment. The main thing is, do not put your phone on hold, because it will interfere with the system and we'll have to mute you. And please be aware of conversations and background noise coming in. A lot of us are working out of our homes now, and so there might be background noise. Just be aware of that so that it doesn't interfere with the meeting. And I guess I want to talk about the virtual meeting and the research that's been done on how they work and don't work. And it certainly is wonderful technology to be able to sit here and talk to each other and see each other, but you have to understand that there is a lag. So when I'm speaking to you, you might hear my voice 1.2 seconds later. Now, does that matter? Well, it does to the human perception. The research has shown that a delay of 1.2 seconds can cause people to perceive the responder less friendly or focused. The research also shows that you have to really pay more attention, and it's more stressful to participate in a virtual meeting than in a face-to-face. We miss the direct eye-to-eye nonverbal communication. So nonverbal communication is very difficult to get in the virtual world because of the lag in technology, and it can make us misinterpret what we think we're hearing and seeing. And the point of all that is just test your perceptions. If you thought you heard something and it made you feel like a reaction, check it out with the person to make sure that's really what's happening, because the technology really can do that. It's interesting. And there's been quite a lot of research and peer-reviewed studies on it, and more now that people are doing this. So I just wanted folks to be aware of that. Okay, the meeting, it is being recorded, so I want you to be aware of that. And that the recording, of course, will be posted and available, so if folks want to go and look at it or go back to watch it, or others who couldn't make it want to watch it, that will be available on the website. So now I'm going to do a roll call, and then I'm going to review the agenda and take care of some other logistical things before we get going. So hit your space bar to unmute yourself when I call on you. Chad Taylor.
Here.
Okay. Chuck Marks. Mike O'Connell.
Here.
Okay. John Solomon.
Here.
Georgia Ackerman.
Here.
Lee Edmiston. Well, we know Lee's here, so I'm going to mark him here. Chad Hansen. Chad? Yeah, he's here. Anita Grove.
Here.
She's here. And I want to introduce a new member, and we have three, and I'll do that as we get there, and that's Ricky Jones, who's graciously agreed to replace Smokey Parrish on our community advisory board because of Smokey's time commitment. Smokey's still involved and will be informed and kept going. Ricky, would you like to say just something about yourself, like who you are and what you represent, real briefly?
Yes, sir. Thank you. I hope you can hear me. My audio is cutting in and out. My name is Ricky Jones. I'm a lifetime resident of Franklin County, new to the commission in the last 4 years, and just excited to help be a part of the conversation.
And we really appreciate you participating, Ricky, and we want to welcome you to the board.
Thank you.
All right. Next is Chip Bailey. Chip, are you on? I didn't see Chip. Frank Giddis, I know Frank wasn't going to make it today. All right, and next we have Michael Dasher, who is a new member being added to help shore up our need for seafood industry watermen. Michael is a commercial fisherman and oysterman. Michael, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself?
He was not going to be able to attend.
Oh,
He
that's right.
already had a trip
Right.
planned and he had to go out.
Right. I forgot. Yep, he's shrimping today. I forgot. But anyway, Michael has agreed to join the board and will be at the next meeting. So we'll have an additional waterman, oysterman, commercial fisherman on our board, which I think is wonderful and needed. All right, next is Shannon Hartsfield. Shannon? All right. Roger Mathis. Roger? We know Roger's here. I believe Vance Millender said he couldn't make it today.
Yeah, that's correct.
Steve Rash. Steve?
I'm here.
All right, and next we have a new member representing Aquaculture, Danita Sasser. Danita has graciously agreed to replace Kerry Williams, whose business obligations have made it difficult for him to attend. So we're really glad to have an active water aquaculturist here. Danita, would you introduce yourself? Hey, Danita, are you there?
She's here. She's unmuting. I think.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
You can. Go ahead.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm
Hi.
Danita. I live over in Ocklawaha Bay, and I'm an oyster farmer for the last five and a half years. We have 6 acres, about, I don't know, a little bit over 1 million oysters we do on our own farm. We're a processor. I own Outlaw Oyster Company, and we are also an equipment dealer for 4 companies around the world. So we supply the Southeast U.S. with oyster farming equipment. So I'm happy to be here.
Thanks, and we welcome you to the board. Glad to have you.
Thank you.
All right, TJ, you there? TJ Ward.
Yes, sir. I'm here.
Very good. Glad to have you here. Glad you can make it. Mike Norberg for Jim Estes.
Yep, I'm here.
Very good. Jenna Harper.
Good morning.
Good morning. Alex Reed.
Good morning.
Morning. And Portia Sapp.
Morning.
And Paul Thurman.
Yep, I'm here.
Very good. And we know Tom Frazier will not be making it today. And then Eric Lovestrand. Eric, you're here.
Here.
Very good. All right. Well, we have a really good turnout. We have we have 19 of 25 members, so that's a good turnout. Glad to have it. Lee needs to get back in again. There we go, Lee.
Yeah, he's coming.
Okay, so what I'd like to do is I'm going to share my screen for a second here. And this is one of the examples of technology, delays in technology that happens between me pushing the button and you all actually seeing it. So just bear with us on this. Okay, I'm trying to get this thing. All right, is that reasonably viewable to folks, the agenda? Okay. So today's agenda is to continue where we left off, to approve the reports, the agenda, take a look at an updated work plan, and we'll have a brief discussion about potentially holding some additional meetings since we are doing these virtually, and they're shorter than the original 6 hours that we had on our face-to-face meetings, and see where we could pick up some of that there. Then we're going to have some presentations. Ed Camp from UF will provide us with a briefing on his decision support tool, his modeling and provide a demonstration. And then Laura Gesselbrock from TNC will give us a habitat suitability analysis predicting modeling presentation. So after that, we'll probably take a break, and then we'll jump into our 5 goal areas: healthy and productive bay ecosystem, sustainable management of oyster resources, a thriving economy, and engaged stakeholder in the plan. And in each instance, we'll be looking at proposed revisions to, in some cases, objectives, but mostly to strategies. Additional strategies were provided in the worksheet, and that's what we'll be working in primarily is the worksheet. And then we'll take public comment, talk about what we would need for the next meeting, which is currently scheduled for September 9th, and then call it a day at 12:30. Does anybody have any members have any questions on the agenda? And if not, I'd ask for a motion to approve it as it was distributed.
This is Chad Hansen. Motion to approve.
Portia, a second.
All right, we have a motion and a second from Hanson and Sapp respectively. Any discussion? Hearing no discussion, all in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? It's unanimous. Very good. Okay, you received either through the mail or electronically, depending on your preference, the May 22nd, 2020 facilitator summary report of our last CAB meeting. Does anybody have any revisions or corrections to that? And if not, I'd ask for a motion to accept the facilitator summary report as it was distributed.
So moved.
All right, we have a motion from Steve Rash. Is there a second?
Second, Michael Connell.
Second from Mike. Any discussion? No discussion. All in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? It's unanimous as well. Okay, so what I like to do now is, everybody has the agenda packet, and in addition to the agenda, when you turn to page 4 and 5 is our sort of our work plan and schedule. So as you see, these reflects the meetings we've already done, and we're down here on meeting number 6 to July 16th. Member presentations, just like what I reviewed on the agenda packet. And then currently our next meeting is September 9th and then November 12th. And so what I would like to put on the table is the possibility of, since our meetings are shorter and it seems likely that we will continue to meet for at least the near term, the next, who knows how long, in the virtual world, I would suspect for all of this year, I think would be a pretty safe guess based on what we're seeing statistically trend-wise in Florida. And if that's not the case, that's great. But in the meantime, the thought is, hey, maybe we should do some more meetings. So maybe we could add a meeting in October, and we'll just get some general sense of y'all about that, and then we'll propose a date. And then perhaps to December, I do not think that we're going to be ready to do a public workshop in December, because I don't think that we'll be far enough along to really shop stuff. And the COVID thing is making it difficult to do what we would envision as a workshop that would be highly productive. But we will do workshops at various points in the process to sort of shop existing work product with the community. So it's possible we could do, an October and then a December meeting, and we'd pick up about enough to make up for some of the lost hours that we've had, and so we can sort of try to catch up where we would hope to be by the first of the year. So on general, the folks support that generally, and you can raise your thumbs or speak if you like. Does anybody like to say anything about that proposal? Anita says yes. Anybody else? Okay. Anybody? Go ahead, Mike.
I'm good with it.
Okay, Chad?
Same. Yeah, I'm good with it.
All right. Anybody have heartburn? Chad Taylor, you wanted to say something?
No, I just said the other chat's good with it.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you. All right. Well, I'll take that as an affirmative. Georgia, you good?
I was just going to comment, it would be good at some point if we have some discussion on public awareness effort so the community knows what we've been working on.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. That, and also the fact that each of you represents constituents, and hopefully are, as part of the role of the stakeholder is to talk to your constituent folks between meetings and bring additional information and ideas to the table. But sure, we can do that.
Jeff, if I may, on to that point, I'm in the process of putting together one paper on the on the closure, the possible closure of the bay. And I'm also Taylor had brought it up a couple of meetings ago, putting together some talking points for the CAB members.
Yeah, so let me do this. Let's
Okay.
save all that. And what I've added is at the end of the meeting, we'll talk about thoughts for public participation and what we might do in the short term.
Okay, sounds good.
Great. So I'm going to put Georgia and Felicia.
Add Anita to that too.
Okay. Well, yeah, absolutely. Anybody else? So we'll save a little time at the end. So that's the proposal. Sounds like folks are good with it. With that, we'll move into our first presentation, which will be Ed Camp. So Ed will take the screen now and provide his presentation. Ed, is your preference that folks wait till you're concluded to ask questions, or how would you like to do that?
I'm pretty ambivalent on it. If somebody's got a burning question and they're afraid that they're going to miss their chance to ask it, go ahead.
Okay.
Otherwise, wait till the end. We'll try to share screen now.
So if you do have questions, then let me know and it'll answer. So Ed, since we have a couple of new members, just maybe briefly introduce yourself and your role so that they're aware of it.
For sure, yeah, I'm planning on doing that. So my name is Ed Camp. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Florida. Assistant professor means I am young and untenured, which means my job is reasonably secure, but not as secure as I would like it to be. So my interest in doing this is to produce some work that's helpful. The job I have is primarily associated with providing information that helps management agencies and stakeholders make good decisions about resources. So that's what I do. I do a lot of quantitative modeling. I'll explain that more in a minute. I work on different fisheries, typically recreational fisheries or commercial fisheries. I've worked on oysters for a while. I was involved with some of the initial work that UF did. Not all of it was great following the 2012 collapse of oysters. So I've been around the system for a little bit, but there's massive amounts that I don't know, and that will be something that I keep reminding you of throughout the presentation. So the purpose of today is to quickly review my role in the CAB and provide you a couple mental models that I have found helpful for keeping in mind, and I will suggest them to you. Whether you take them or not is up to you. I will review the types of quantitative models that I deal with in general. I'm going to give you a description of the model in its current state, which I will tell you is not finished at all. I'll give you a simple demonstration, assuming that the code works, which is always fun. And that will show you a little bit of what I do. And then we'll talk about what's missing with this model and have time for questions and concerns, of which I'll have a couple of my own. So the first image I'd give you is that of an onion. This is one way to try to talk about things. I realize that we all have complicated jobs and I can't do probably anybody else's job on here. The work that I do is pretty complicated in its own way, and I'm going to try to describe it in simpler terms first and get more detailed as we go along this talk, but also over the meetings. So yeah, basically we're going to be like unwrapping an onion one layer at a time. Where my work fits into the overall project idea, starting backwards. So I'm charged with producing a quantitative model to predict how fishery management, restoration, and water changes will affect oyster population. Oh, I'm sorry, this is showing up there, isn't it? Basically, I produce an oyster model that makes predictions about what happens when we do things, like what-if analysis. It's supposed to complement sampling that's being done by FWRI, led by Melanie Parker, and it's supposed to inform FWC's, particularly Jim Estes and Mike Norberg's management actions. Now, this model is going to have as input some information about the water quality throughout the bay. That information is going to be provided by the hydrodynamic model that Steve Morey is working on. Now, Steve Morey's hydrodynamic model is going to take as input for it the water entering the bay, and that is going to be provided by the hydrologic model that Steve Lightman is working on. So this is how your three modelers hopefully will have their things fit together. So my role in the broad picture is to guide the development of an oyster model. It's supposed to represent oyster populations and fisheries. It needs to be scientifically rigorous, but equally as important, it has to be something that the CAB at least reasonably is comfortable with. And that's a challenge because there's a lot of different assumptions that have to go into any model, and there's different opinions on which ones we should do. So we can explore that as much as we have the time to. So reviewing what I need from the CAB, or what I would most like from them, would be healthy and productive skepticism. Skepticism is the correct view of science. That's what it's based off. So I want you to tell me if you think I'm making assumptions that are unreasonable. And specifically, I'd ask that you try to view it from the standpoint of, you know, how can we make the model better? I'm well aware that what I'm going to do in the model is a pretty crass interpretation of reality, and it has to be that way for us to be able to make useful predictions. I'll talk more about that in a second. But it can be a better representation of reality with your input and help on it. And ultimately, the people that I learned modeling from repeatedly told me the most useful thing you can do out of a model is use it to help discussion, to get people on the same page so that we can talk about different things. It isn't intended to replace that discussion. It's intended to facilitate it. So this is the second mental image that I would invite you to keep in mind, which is that these models are drawings of reality. They're not photographs, they're not reality in itself. They're sketches. You have in front of you the extent of my Microsoft Paint skills, which is unimpressive. But this is helpful for modeling. This is what we're doing. They're rough sketches about what the reality looks like. Okay, so specifically how the model works is we make a series of assumptions about oysters and fisheries and then translate them into mathematical and statistical equations. And I code them into a program. I'm using Program R, which is not real computer code, but it's what I know, so that's what I use. Then I have to explain it well enough that we can revise it with CAB input. And once we have made the assumptions that we want, it needs to be fit to data. This is the part I haven't done yet. I don't have all the data in hand to fit it. I'm expecting to get that soon. And then once we do that, we revise it. We go over it a number of times. And once we have a model that we think this is a reasonable representation of not just the way things are now, but the way the system functions, now we can do the fun part, which is making predictions about the environment, management, and restoration. So just to review this quickly, is the purpose of the model is to make the discussions easier and more useful. It predicts the likely and unlikely outcomes of different things that we would do with closures, with restoration, with different management options. And in this case, the model is going to have a socioeconomic component too. So we'll try to tell us, hey, here's how we think this might translate to economic contribution, which is money cycling through Franklin County and surrounding areas, as well as economic value. And it's supposed to help us learn something. It's supposed to help increase some understanding of oysters and fisheries. A lot of that learning is going to happen on my part too. Please remember, it's not a perfect representation of reality. If you expect it to be that, you will be very and repeatedly disappointed. Okay, so the model in its current state, this is what I want to go over now. It's a simulated fish oyster population. It's not fit to Apalachicola Bay yet, so I'm going to show you how the model works, but this is just a generic oyster fish population. It's spatially implicit. Now, what that means is that I'm modeling the population as if it's one big population. I'm not modeling specific bars. Both of these things will be changed. I will be able to fit the data to Apalachicola. We're going to see which bars I can specifically fit it to, and that's going to be back and forth. I don't know how that's going to play out yet, whether I have to fit it to the bay as a whole and then parse up based off what the CAB thinks about which bars should have the most of that population and which shouldn't. We'll sort that out. But right now what I do, sorry, someone asking a question, I can't see everybody and present at the same time, so please interrupt me. Jeff or Bob, was there a question that you were aware of?
Sorry, I muted myself. No, that's just the background conversation somebody's having.
Okay, no problem. Thank you. Okay, so, but what I do have is a built-in the key dynamics of oyster populations in terms of the natural mortality, fishing mortality, recruitment, and shell dynamics. And this gives you an idea of, had the model been fit, what we get to play around with. So basically what I'm telling you is I've skipped over to make a dummy model, and I'm going to show you how we can use it to make predictions. And the reason I'm doing this is back to this onion. I want to give you a picture of how everything works overall before we, 3 months down the road, like, okay, now we have a fit model. Now you get to see how it actually works. I want to give people this idea of this is what it can do, and then we'll make it better. All right, so again, not fit to Apalachicola data yet. That means, for anybody who is listening to this, these are not predictions about what will happen in Apalachicola Bay. Okay, so let's look at a simple demonstration of a too simple oyster life cycle where we have eggs, and eventually those eggs through a density-dependent process turn into recruits, little oysters that are through density-dependent mortality, and then those turn into harvestable adults, which can also spawn and produce eggs. Why have I made it too simple? This is the type of a drawing that we expect most fish populations work through, because most fish populations don't produce shell, that's their own habitat. So this is sort of a basic fishery model turned into oysters. And what we can do with it is we plug these equations in and we can say, well, without fishing, everything should be at equilibrium, assuming no stochastic variation, which we can throw it in there, but it just makes the results more confusing at this point. So we see eggs and harvestable adults and recruits. Don't worry about these units. It's in more than thousands of kilograms for some of them. So. And then we can say, okay, well, we actually think that there's fishing, and what would happen then? Well, okay, if you're going to have fishing, you're going to be harvesting some of the adults, and that will be some decrease in recruits, but not that many, and there'll be a decrease in eggs. And then we can say, well, what if we decided that was too much? So we implement some reduction in fishing effort, signified by that red dotted line there, and then we see the populations bounce back. This is basically what we expect in regular fish populations. This is the basis of fisheries management. But we say, well, that was obviously too simple, so let's look at this life cycle where we have eggs that have to settle on some substrate like shell in order to recruit, in order to become harvestable adults that are mature and then produce more eggs. So now this is more complex, and specifically it's complex because it doesn't just go like this. Eggs have to settle on shell to recruits to adults to more eggs. The adults make more shell. So if we lose adults, we're not just saying, well, we have fewer eggs, we're saying we also have fewer places for the eggs to settle on. And I know that everybody here knows that, but it is a really different process in the modeling. And we can get into that later if anybody wants to talk about it in detail. Now, without fishing, you have something that looks remarkably similar. The population stays steady, and that makes sense. But under specific assumptions about that relationship between the amount of shell and how much habitat is there for the recruitment. So relationship between shell up here and recruitment. When we start fishing, we have something really different going on where, okay, you start fishing and you fish it down to some lower equilibrium and it looks like it's stable. And it will appear that you're at an equilibrium, but actually what you're doing is slowly pushing yourself closer to a threshold where you won't have enough shell. And once you go over that threshold and you don't have much shell, you actually decrease your harvestable adults. And in this case, just quick detail, as I've built the model with sort of a safety threshold saying you never lose all of the habitat for recruitment. This is basically representing the reality that there's some hard substrate under the shell that spat can be on, but it's not as good as an actual built up reef. Okay, so then we can.
Sorry, can I ask a question real quick?
For sure. Can you tell me who's talking?
This is Chad Hansen. For this shell model, the model that includes the shell, did you build this, Ed, or is this something that's a basic model that's used for shellfish elsewhere? Just want to clarify that.
Yeah, that's a fair question. I built this model. It is standing on work that other people have done. Gotcha. So it's like I built it with an asterisk. I don't want to take all the credit for it. Yeah. You guys can blame me if you don't like it. Carl Walters, who's someone I learned a lot of modeling from, I'll just give you some details real quick. You can modify the recruitment relationships depending on how much habitat you think is remaining. So that's been published in a number of papers. I've published it before, but I'm using something that Carl built, and that's been well published. It's basically saying, hey, if you've lost 50% of your habitat for recruitment, that's going to affect your recruits. And then a couple other folks, Mike Wilberg up at Chesapeake Bay Lab at the University of Maryland, who our facilitators have worked quite a bit with. He's put some papers out showing that you have these shell dynamics. This is something that Tom Saniat, who works with Melanie Parker at FWRI, has done some really nice work on, showing that you have, I think they've referred to it as a shell budget model that we've heard about before. And then Jacob Moore at maybe UC Davis has done some empirical and simulation work showing that there is expected to be a relationship between the shell and the recruits. Now, the tricky bit is we don't know exactly the functional form of that relationship or exactly the shape. And I'm showing you one of them here. We can explore some different ones. But if you want, I can talk for a lot longer about why I think it has to be certain ways and not others. But it is always going to be one of the real challenges here. And I'll just explain this as simply as I can, which is saying, we're basically making an assumption that there's some limit of shell beneath which it's really tough to get recruitment. And the reality is, I don't know what that limit is in Apalachicola, and it may be really different in Apalachicola than somewhere else. And it also may be really different depending on the hydrologic conditions. Maybe a certain amount of shell is needed when you have certain conditions, and maybe you need a lot more shell when you have different conditions. We just don't know all of the interactions there. So it's going to be a big uncertainty associated with this. I don't think I'm going to be able to resolve it with fitting, because I don't have, and I've not heard of anyone having really great information about how much shell has been in the bay over a time series. If we knew the heights and the spatial areas of the bars for the entire time series that we had fishery removals for, I think we could get at it, but we don't know that. So we can talk about, as a CAB, do we want to try to have the people who have been around here longest and have the most experience try to at least draw one up for me that I can input or something like that? But it's a fair question, Chad, and it's just going to be tough to know more. But that's, my job isn't to make a perfect model. My job is to make the best model of what we think we know.
Great.
So that was a long answer.
Thank you.
Okay, so we can put in a fishery reduction, and we can reduce fishing effort, but what you see here is that you have very little improvement in the recruits and the harvestable adults compared to what you had before, although I would note that actually you're bouncing back in your harvest, not quite to what you had before, but a fair amount. The purpose of this is just to say we have different knobs, and one of them is, when we put this closure, or in this case, it's not a full closure, it's just a reduction. How much do we reduce effort? Do we reduce it by 50%, 25%, 80%? The point is we have a knob that we get to play around with for that. And then you can add other knobs in, and you can say, well, what if we add some restoration to that, so we can determine when that shows up? That's this green line. I now realize I should not have used red and green because those are not the colors you use, but anyway, I did. So this second line here is when the restoration occurs, and the restoration is simulated as adding more shell, which gives you this bump in recruits that translates through with a little bit of a lag. And we can determine how much shell you add. And I've also added in a component that says, hey, after you add the shell, you're going to completely shut down fishing for some amount of time. And that's another knob that we can turn. So there's all these different things that we can play with. And so you can explore what your assumptions yield in terms of the ultimate outcomes. And that's the purpose of these simulation models, the what if analysis. So you can figure out what situations do you have to do to get these big bounce backs, where you say, well, we restored even more and we shut the fishing down a little bit lower. We allowed a lower sustainable amount of fishing, and that it gets you over that threshold and it bumps you up till you have a really, really healthy system again. So that's how it works. What it actually looks like. How am I doing for time? Jeff and Bob.
What I suggest is you just do what you need to do, because this is going to be an important piece throughout the project. So let's just, take the time we need for you to do your presentation and not feel rushed.
Okay. So I'm assuming everyone should still see this. This is what I use for my code. It's not the most elegant, but I use it. So it's just a big text file, and it colors my words so that I can try to keep them straight. And it has a bunch of assumptions about oysters, and I write notes in here so that I don't screw up too bad. And it has, this is a bunch of assumptions about shell, and then you have an actual function that runs your model. And this is where all the math is. And then I can write little functions to make plots. And if I've done that right, what I can do is then take a piece of code at the end of this, and I can run it, and I'll drag this over here. And what do that. There we go. And what it will do is produce little plots of what happens. So what that means is that, assuming this all works fine, we should be able to take this little exploration piece and run that and see what happens. So in this case, we can go up here and we can say, well, these are the different knobs we have. We can change the assumption about shell to, I think it's Lin, and run it, and you have a very different result. So you say, well, that was not what we wanted. So we can take it back to thresh safe, and we can say, well, we're going to not put in restoration and see if that works. So here we don't have restoration, we just have a fishery closure. Or we can put restoration back in, and we can say that instead of allowing 20% of the original effort, we're only going to allow 10% of the original effort. And we make those changes, you can rerun. And this is where you have your big bump up. The reason I picked this one specifically is, even though this isn't fit to Apalachicola, what it is showing us is that if I make the assumption that there's this specific relationship between shell and recruits, which the literature and which people have told us is almost certainly there, then the model becomes pretty sensitive. It becomes what we call tippy, or it can produce alternative stable states. And it means that making a small decision, like the difference between whether you're going to have 10% or 20% of the new effort, that can produce a big difference in your results. So this is 10%, and that's 20%. And it's not the only thing that's sensitive. If we have it at 10% of effort still, but we don't restore as much, and we also don't get that bump. So this is why it's pretty important for us to have some idea of what we're going to do with restoration. This is something that I think actually a paper that FWC worked on just came out showing that you can have these thresholds with the restoration. Basically, if you don't restore to enough shell, whatever that is, the restoration may not be useful. And we sure need to try to figure that out, and we need to err on one side, not the other, because if we spend $20 million restoring a really big area, but we don't do it tall enough to provide enough shell to get that recruitment to start the system up again, to jumpstart it, then we're basically not gonna get much of a bounce back. So,
Hey, Ed.
Yeah.
Chad Hansen here again. I think it might be helpful to walk through some of those assumptions you have and what you were just changing, and kind of talk a little bit about what those changes are and how I think because that's pretty fundamental for understanding how this model is working. So maybe talking to you about some of those parameters might be useful. Because I was going to ask, what are you considering restoration? You're turning it on and off, but like there's various degrees of that. So I'd like a better understanding of what you're actually running here for scenarios, just as a dummy model.
Sure, I will do that, but I will caveat it with saying these ones are cheap to change. So it's pretty easy for me to alter the knobs that we put in the model. Sometimes if you ask a specific thing, like if you want me to change your growth rate, that actually becomes not cheap. That becomes a real pain in the neck to change the way that they grow over time or something like that. You can do it, it just is a little bit harder. But so I'll walk through so you see what I'm changing with these things, but none of this is set in stone at all. But I will explain it. So C-star, this is a toggle switch. This tells me basically how I'm going to modify the survival of the oysters when we decrease their habitat. I can change it to one way or another. It has a very empirical and biological basis. This parameter here is effort. It's simply assuming that there's a constant effort every month, which is a pretty gross simplification. In reality, there'd be some sinusoidal effort pattern throughout the year. We would need to add in that detail if we wanted to explore really specific interactions between when the fishing happens and when the water is certain qualities.
Sorry, Ed, to interrupt. I just wanted you to know that you have another question from TJ when you get ready for it.
Okay.
I wanted to mention one thing here, if you don't mind, because I don't want us to go too far down into the weeds at this point. What Ed is showing here is, a simulation, and the irrelevance for the working group, for the most part, is that we can propose a series of strategies or options, and Ed will make adjustments according to that. And this will give us, once he has it, calibrated to Apalachicola, it will give you the likely outcome of that, of whether that strategy would actually work. And combinations are what, like in Chesapeake, it was always combinations that brought the best results. It was always a little longer period of time that brought the best results. And this can demonstrate all that. But go ahead, Ed, and then we'll get TJ's question.
TJ, you can go ahead now if you want.
It's not TJ, it's Shannon.
Okay.
My question is you're relying on spat set on this material. Our issue is not spat set. It's not material, it's spat set. We're having issues, we're having spat set on the material. We have material in our bay that has nothing growing on it, but yet you can go a quarter of a mile to another area and it's loaded with spat. I think we're jumping the gun here. We need to be figuring out what's the cause of our spat limitation, other than just a lack of adult oysters.
Okay. Well, so what the model is actually showing is two separate processes. One is the generation of the spat from the adults, and the second is whether those spats survive long enough to be called recruits, which isn't, I'm not calling anything that settles on shell a recruit. It has to live to be about 15% of an adult oyster's length before we call it a recruit, meaning it made it through that first tricky life history stage. So what that means in reference to your comment is that I can tell you from playing around with this model that both issues are represented and both are concerns. The reason that the model figures don't bounce back when I have a little bit higher effort isn't because we're not putting enough shell out there. It's because there actually isn't enough eggs to produce enough spat on enough of the shell to bounce it back over that hump. I don't know if the words I said make sense. I have a clear mental image here, but when I think that what I'm doing is representing what you're saying here. When you see this, we put a ton of shell out there and you got that bump in recruits, but it didn't last. And the reason, when I go in and look at everything carefully, the reason this doesn't last, the reason you drop your shell back down, is because there actually wasn't enough eggs in the model to settle and colonize that area to jumpstart it and get it going again. And so, you know, if someone wanted to, if you want me to have a stocking piece in there, I can add that, where we get to do that too, where we get to put more spat in. I have no idea how realistic it is that we can do it, but I'm capable of adding that. So I'm not making the assumption that we have plenty of spat at all. And I got to have more time to explain to you really carefully where I am making some big assumptions, because I'm just telling you right now, the place I'm making the big assumptions is the assumptions of how the relationship is between how much shell we have and how much recruits we get, and how habitat quality is affected by the amount of shell. But we absolutely are seeing a system that can be spat limited, which in my model which I would term it as egg limited, but it basically would mean we're not having enough spawning event to put good spat on enough of the habitat there. And if that's something that we feel very strongly about, then what we need to do to make sure that that's in the model is, when we go and fit it, we have to be saying that there actually isn't enough eggs being spawned. And if someone says, no, there are plenty of eggs being spawned, it's just that they're all dying before they settle, we can add that knob in too, but I'm just going to tell you it amounts to the same thing. So I haven't explored all the different ways that we can kill oysters off, but we can kill them off in the model in a lot of different ways. We can have the eggs have mass mortality. We can have the juveniles have mass mortality. We can do all those things if you want to do them.
So
does that help to clarify, Shannon?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let me say something real quick here about this, so that I want to make sure that the community, that the board understands how this, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ed, but you know, how we've done collaborative modeling and other projects like, you know, Fish Mart and Oyster Futures and that, and what we talked about as well. So Shannon and others, what Ed's doing right now is he's getting the model to work based on what data and assumptions that he knows. But Ed will test with the Community Advisory Board the assumptions that are being used, the data sets that are being used, talk it through, just like Shannon may have some different information that will be considered. Well, everybody will be aware of where the uncertainty is, what things we don't know, and we'll, you know, agree on how do we work around that, what makes the most sense. And then once the model is calibrated and fits the Apalachicola Bay system, it'll be calibrated to that stakeholders can see that, yeah, this sort of fits what we know to be reality. And it will be tested with our scientists, it'll be tested with our watermen, all of that, until there's a sweet spot that everybody agrees, yeah, I think we can trust that it's going to run what's likely to be the outcome of any given simulation. And that's a process that will happen over time, and you'll be involved in that. So there's lots of opportunities to input and make tweaks and revisions to that. Was that accurate, Ed?
Absolutely, Jeff, and thank you for pointing that out. And the one thing I would add to it is that we don't even have to settle on one model. You know, what we might do, and what I would recommend doing, is where we realize, hey, we just don't know about this assumption, then what we really should be doing is we should be, you know, let's say we have 3 different models, each correspondent to a different assumption about the way that shell matters for recruitment. We should run all of our potential management options over all those models, or over each of those models, and try to figure out which management option is going to give us at least a good enough answer, regardless of whether we have got it, our assumptions perfect or not. And that's a super important part of it. In the field, we call it management strategy evaluation, but it basically just means we need to make sure that the decisions we're making are reasonably robust to the fact that we don't know everything, and we may get some things wrong, or some things may happen in the future that we just couldn't have seen coming. And my recommendation would be that the CAB selects management actions that are most robust to not knowing things, because when you build these models, it's just really daunting to realize all the things that we don't know, or at least that I don't know. So, yeah.
And the last thing is, given, you know, my statement about time, we do have some time. So what I think, you know, what you're doing is going through it is perfect. Let's get the kind of the big picture understanding, and we'll circle back to these things in subsequent meetings and dig deeper down as folks need to understand it further. But I think it makes most sense to get the big picture of how it basically works, what is, you know, and I think that's the approach for today.
Sure. Okay. So yeah, basically, if you guys have more questions, I'll get to this in a second. I will suggest that we try to find some more time to go over the models in detail for the people who are interested, because it's really, really important that the people who care a lot about how this model is put together have some faith in it. Otherwise, it's just a waste of my time and your time listening to me. But yeah, view this whole thing here as a bunch of knobs that we get to turn, and I can add more knobs and I can take other knobs away. And what I've tried to do is build knobs for the specific assumptions that we have to make. And there'll be some things that, based off the biology, we have to hard code in there, and there'll be other things that we can play around with as much as we want. So, Chad, are you okay with me not going through all of these right now, but just recognizing that there are different knobs about how we change effort, how we change restoration, even if we have changes in natural mortality, all of those things. Is that okay for now, Chad?
Yeah, I guess I wasn't trying to send us down into a rabbit hole, but I just wanted to have a basic understanding of what those knobs were. You know, and I think you've gone over some of them. And so when we get to the point of, you know, making adjustments to, we know what the scenarios are that we want to, like Shannon had raised, is like, how do we want to play with recruitment and shelling, and what scenarios do we think are most logical to find that range of optimal conditions or strategies. So once we get to that point, but I think it's, yeah, I'm happy to continue on, but I think understanding how that model is moving up and down and what's causing it is going to be fundamental to knowing how to help provide that input that's going to be needed.
For sure. So right now, what I've put in there is 4 main knobs. One assumption about that relationship between habitat and recruitment, which I think is incredibly important. A set of knobs about how the fishing mortality or driven by effort changes over time. A set of knobs about restoration. Do we do it? How much do we do it? When do we do it? Do we close fishing for some period after we did it? And then a set of knobs associated with what if we have changes in natural mortality. That's what's in there now. I can add more later. We can turn them all off. This is all of these things, like I said, these are cheap to change.
So that will become the dashboard, and those various knobs are the dashboard, and we'll go through each of those. And when we propose options, the group will decide which of those particular components, those knobs, if you will, on the dashboard will be used for each of the scenarios, right?
Yep, that's correct, Jeff. And again, like the model I'm working with is kind of an onion here. So I'm showing you the overall picture first. I'm not saying that I'm unwilling to go into the details, the actual guts of the model, which is, you know, this is the math, that's up here. Happy to do that, but we can't do it now. And I really think we can talk about this later, but we should probably set aside more time for the people who want to do that. And if, you know, we'll get to that. I have it in my slides here. So let me pop back to this. The summary of this is it lets us look at what would happen if we took this management actions, if the system works like this. Again, these results are not prescriptive or predictive until the model is fit to the data and it's fit well. So the fifth thing here, what's missing from the model is not fit to the data yet. I have the fisheries dependent data. I'm still waiting on the fisheries independent data. But I know that FWRI is slammed right now, and everybody is working under far less than ideal circumstances. So we get it. We'll get it as soon as we can. The model has to be made spatially explicit so that we can make the best use of all the water information that's going to come out of Lightman's and eventually Maury's models. Then we'll have to fine tune the potential management actions in terms of, well, what's realistic, and, you know, what things are we putting in, and can we do a good job of representing it? And finally, we slap the dollar signs on it, which I joke about that because that's what biologists like to do is you just put a dollar sign on it now. It's a socioeconomic model, but I work with enough economists that we'll do this as well as we can. And so this is additional questions and concerns, and I will start with my main one, which is how do we keep people, and by that I mean the CAB, updated about this model? The timing is an issue. You know, it takes time and people to build and fit these models. What I've done, I could do because I'd already done this for some other things. I was able to adapt it, but the hard work starts in fitting the model to the data and to making it spatially explicit. So I can't do that overnight. It will take me time, and it really take me probably a postdoc to help me with it. And I need some data that we don't have yet. So in an ideal world, this would all be done by now, so that, you know, it's just, hey, we have a model. Let me show you what it is, and let's go over it, and let's change these things. But I'm not there yet. So one thing that I would hope we talk about, whether it's right now or whether it's later in the meeting, because it sounds like Jeff and Bob have carved out some time to talk about future plans anyway, is I would be willing to show up for additional virtual meetings, as many as we need within reason, to go over models with people and to try to get as much understanding as people want to be comfortable with the model before we move to stuff.
Ed, what I was going to suggest is that at this point, it would probably make sense for us to have an update at each meeting. We certainly did that at Oyster Future. So each meeting we put, 20 minutes or whatever it is, so you can provide additional updates, answer questions, and we keep people informed in the questions and input all throughout the process until you're done fitting the model to the Bay. So that's what I would recommend, is that we just put that as a standing agenda item going forward, because we're getting at the point now where it's going to be important. So.
Yep, I'm happy to do that. But I'm also aware that, what I just did was like skipping over like a decade of my learning, and I don't expect people to just pick that up overnight. So if people do want more time for me to explain, how the things work and why I'm doing them that way, I'm happy to do that. We just have to find time that works with the CAB's budget, or if people want to email me individual questions, I'll answer them as best as I can. But I'm sensitive to the fact that this is a black box to everybody except me, and that I'm asking people to, 20 minutes a meeting won't be enough time to give a healthily skeptical person faith in the model. And that's kind of what we need. So I'm willing to put in more time if people have concerns about it.
One more thing on that is, that's just to kind of give update throughout the discussions of our strategies. The model will be discussed and questions will be asked all throughout the meeting once we get going. That's how it happened in the other collaborative modeling projects I worked on. So it's not that there's only 20 minutes, it's that there's a brief presentation to provide any updates. And then throughout the course of our discussions, offering strategies and simulations, it's going to come up, and you'll, discuss it with the members. You'll make, they'll say, I don't think this is going to work based on this, and we'll make adjustments. So I think it's going to be organic and iterative. And so it's not really just restricted to that. Once we're kind of moving with strategies, it's going to be embedded in the process, in the discussion throughout.
Okay.
Hey, Ed, so I have a couple just quick things real quick, or questions and comments.
That's Mike Norberg.
Yeah, Mike Norberg. So one thought is, how spatially explicit the model is going to be. I think kind of going back to the opportunity to have multiple different models or multiple different inputs available is, looking at it either bar level or even stepping between bar level and bay level is, shellfish harvest area or seasons of areas where certain bars are open. Because from a management perspective, the bar level is great if we're able to manage it at a bar level. But we, tend to, under the current management, it's more this portion of the bay is open during this time of the year, or this availability. So in some situations that doesn't encompass an individual bar, such as Cat Point. But in others, there is that potential where there's crossovers. So one part of a large bar is open during the summer, whereas it's not open during the winter.
Sure.
I think trying to break it down, from a spatial level is bay wide, because it's an entire ecosystem. It's not just one bar is not driving the entire bay system at theoretical level, at least. And then stepping down into a little bit finer details and a number of steps. And then the other thing I had that I think is an important conversation piece, even if it's only at the theoretical level, is one knob, and I saw one in there. It looked like it was a rest effort, something, kind of how long before we start allowing fishing. I think that's a big one. That's really important is, so this restoration goes into place, and we do see, a single generation of adult oysters within a year or 2 years. So if there's a delay from when the restoration goes into place, being able to turn that knob and say, okay, we feel that there needs to be this level or lower fishing effort until we have a certain time post restoration where we can actually sustain a harvest, as opposed to just as soon as we see them, let's get them type approach. Does that make sense? Is that
Yep, that makes sense. So right now I've crudely done that by just saying there's a fixed amount of time. However, I can build more complicated rules, and this is the job of the management strategy part of the project. Is we can say I can replicate sampling of the bars, and we can say if there's fewer than X density of oysters per hectare, then the fishing is going to be decreased, or there won't be any fishing. So we can build in all of the rules that people want, and we can try to represent the 300 or 400 bushels per hectare if we want to put that in there, more complex rules. The other comment I would make about space is just to highlight that the spatial scale at which I draw, I'm doing air quotes, the spatial scale at which I make the model does not have to be the spatial scale that we manage at. And ideally, it would be smaller. Ideally, we'd represent individual bars because that's where we can benefit the most from the hydrodynamic and hydrologic models. But then we'd zoom out and say, okay, we're representing oysters at this small level, not the individual oyster, because I'm not able, I personally don't want to do that. It's real, but anyway, we can represent reality at a fine detail. Imagine like a really detailed sketch, but we can paint the management with broader swaths in the zones or as the bay as a whole. So that will be options. What I would recommend is we have the most spatially finely scaled spatial operating model that we're comfortable with. The problem is the finer scale you have, the more assumptions you have to make. So this is where we are reliant on the fisheries data and on the fisheries independent data that Mel Parker has, as well as the expert opinion of people on the cabs.
Yeah, I think that's a great comment, that the operating model needs to be as fine as we can get, because it's easier to back out of as fine as possible than it is to try to assume what's underlying this more overarching high level model. So I think that's a really good comment.
All right, before I exit this PowerPoint, does anybody have specific questions about the PowerPoint or anything that you want me to share my screen with?
Chad Taylor, did you have a question you wanted to ask Ed, or?
Yes, Chad here. I've worked with these models in the ACF stakeholders with Harris, Georgia Caucus, and Steve before, and I hear you repeatedly mentioning budget. And I know we ran into a lot of budget issues with how much you can do with setting the model up, and then how many scenarios and runs you can make. How big of an issue is that in our modeling efforts here? As far as, I haven't seen the whole budget, I just haven't looked. I guess it's probably available somewhere within our process here. Is that a limiting factor to you, or are you just kind of here for our unlimited use for however much we want to ask you to do?
Yes and no. So relative to the really fancy, crazy high resolution hydrodynamic and hydrologic models, this is cheap. I was running the model in real time for you. The results are instant. You want to turn a knob, I get the results in seconds. When we put in all the spatial areas At the most, it's going to be minutes. So it's not like we're limited by computation time. In terms of my availability of the project, I'm anticipating that we're getting that I will receive a grant from FWC. We're all agreed on that. We just are dealing with UF and FWC logistics on getting that approved, but I should be paid to do this, so it's my job. So I don't think we're limited so far by that. That's what you mean by budget, right?
Yes, exactly. Because we might want to run hundreds of scenarios. I don't think we will, but maybe we'll get to the point where we can run what we need, maybe not what we want or can.
For sure. I mean, if everything goes well, what I will do eventually is we'll have this model with stochasticity in it, which means with the random environmental variation, even with observation error in it. And then we're going to run each scenario thousands of times to not only see what is the most likely outcome, but what are the reasonably likely outcomes that we could get to. So these models are so computationally cheap compared to the really large, finely detailed hydrodynamic and hydrologic models that you personally have been exposed to before. They're, you know, the coders on that would laugh at mine and be like, this is child's play. This really is, you've got a coloring book here.
Thank you.
Jeff, could I add a comment with the hydrologic model in that we're not using the same model that Aris Georgakakis used? And consequently, I can do a 73-year run in 15 seconds that calibrates quite well with what the model Aris Georgakakis was using. So the cost and the limits on the number of runs from the hydrologic side is not a problem.
Thanks, Steve.
So, and I want to, Ed brought up the funding opportunity, and I wanted to jump in real quick and make sure that the CAB is aware. So through this NIFWIF project that FWC received funding for, part of this information, you know, I think it's something to keep in mind that the CAB we're trying to run parallel the CAB and this NIFWIF project that is taking off now, and using data from this group to help inform the NIFWIF stuff that FWC is working on. And we do have the intent and are working on a contract to get Ed on board with our project to do some management modeling. So using all this information, it's not just going to end here at the CAB or the ABSI level. It's also going to be incorporated into the NIFWIF, that $20 million project that FWC has. So really good collaboration across many people and many groups throughout the area.
Okay. Anybody else have any questions or comments regarding Ed's presentation?
Yeah, this is Chad Hansen once again. It might make sense, and we can talk about this later, just wanted to throw this out there. It might make sense to have a separate working group that can dive deeper into these models and help construct some of the scenarios and get a better understanding of it, and then bring that back to the group and kind of summarize what's been going on kind of in between the meetings. Just something I was thinking about, like for a handful of people that might want to really dive in and help understand, or get a better understanding of what's going on, and rather than trying to have these really detailed conversations, which we don't probably have enough time for, maybe there's we can have a subset of folks to go through these models and to go back and forth with that, and then to construct those and bring those to the larger group and summarize what we've done and what we're looking at. Just an idea.
Chad, I had just started thinking about that and just sending out a email to the entire group and getting a list of the people who are particularly interested, and then setting up a time when we can do just exactly that.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds fine. I'm going to call on Georgia. One quick thing, though, I do think it's important, though, that we still have updates at every meeting so that everybody gets at least that level. But I think Chad's idea is fine.
Yeah, absolutely.
Go ahead, Georgia.
I agree with Chad Hansen's comment, and as a non-scientist in the room, I'd like to better understand some of the basics of the model. So that may be a separate discussion, or Chad or Ed or somebody may need to tutor me. For example, I'd like to better understand how do we actually know how much seed is there. So we've got all these different parts and these variables or knobs, as you all keep calling them. I'd like to understand how we measure some of that for those of us that don't do that for a living. So,
Yeah, that's super reasonable. And sorry, did I cut you off, Georgia? Yeah, I should also tell everybody that like I call them knobs, but if you call them knobs to another modeler, they may not know what you're talking about. So that's on me. I think that's a great idea, and I'm very sensitive to that. And that's why I said, like, it's not like nobody just wakes up and starts doing this. So I would be more than happy to go over some of the basics of it, because if not enough people get what the basics are, then I think it's unreasonable to ask you to trust what the results are. So, but we just may have to set time up for that. And that's what they did with FishSmart, right, Jeff?
No, I mean, we did it all in the meetings with FishMart and Oyster Futures. The only thing we did separate in Oyster Futures is the Waterman, and we did that at meetings, but sort of after or before, would sit down with maps and sort of corroborate with the scientists what they knew about the bottom, about the substrate, about the spat, about all that. But it doesn't mean we can't do it. It's perfectly fine to do it, or we could dedicate a meeting to do it if most people felt it was critical. But I think the most important point is that, you know, and this goes to George's questions, and that's sort of testing and understanding the data sets and reaching some agreement between scientists and stakeholders on what the data sets are, and also on what the assumptions that are being built into the model are. So once we get those are things that we'll be doing throughout early on, once we get moving into the modeling. And that's the role of the CAB, is to kind of shop and vet that, and so that people are comfortable with it. And so like what George was saying, everybody needs to be comfortable, because we're not going to trust the results of the simulations if people don't understand that, yeah, I agree that the data was good. I do that the assumptions, and we understand the uncertainty and how it's been accounted for, and we believe that it's accurately calibrated to what we believe to be the real situation in the bay. And those are the kind of things that take time, and, you know, we'll do it however it's best done, whether we have a special meeting or whether we do it piece by piece. You know, we can discuss all that. But I think that those who want a super deep dive into the harder facts of it, that should be a separate meeting. You know, committee would be fine, something like that. Any other comments, Roger? You have to unmute yourself, Roger. Here, let me see if I can unmute him.
How about that?
That's it. You're good now.
Okay, it's been going off and on. But I looked at those models and how he got it set up. But does it say, how do you control about the water that goes across the quality of the water or the water? I mean, I didn't see nothing on there about the water. And the water what makes them all grow, ain't it?
Sure. Yeah, so no, you're right. You're right. And I didn't do a great job explaining that. What I would propose that we do is we have the changes in the water affect the natural mortality of the oysters. So that's why I have those knobs in there to change the natural mortality. Right now, it's a pretty crude knob. I can build much more detailed ones, so we can have it go to different schedules, and we can have it affect specific oysters. We can also alter the growth. It just requires building a lot more. So that's something that I would like you guys to really, really want before I go ahead and do it, because it makes all of the calculations.
Well, that's what I was wondering. I said, because that water, I mean, for thousands of years they've been growing with that water. If there's something in the water or not in the water, that makes all the difference in the world. Is what the models are going to do, right?
The two ways that I can have water affect the oysters are the growth and the natural mortality.
Okay.
And the tricky bit is that growth and natural mortality are supposed to be related to each other, because the bigger animals die at a lower rate than the smaller animals. Okay. So I just have to do the accounting right so that we're not double counting anything. And I have to do the accounting right so that we have growth changing over time, but I can do that. It's a lot easier to tweak the natural mortality, and from the papers I've read, that's what people have been most concerned about. But if but if you want to tweak the growth instead, we can get to that. We just I have to spend some more time and do it differently.
Well, I just want to ask that question. I mean, it might have been stupid, but I just, I kind of want to clarify it.
It's not a stupid question. Go ahead.
I should have made that more clear. It's not stupid at all. The plan would be, Steve Morey is going to give us this detailed model about what the water quality is like at a pretty fine scale all throughout the bay. And then what I want to do from that is I want to take the average, the extremes of that information, and I want to put that on to how the natural mortality is going to affect oysters at different bars around the bay. That's the plan.
Okay.
Right now, with the current model, it would be something much more crude, or a little scribble, which would be saying like, hey, Steve said water bad, so natural mortality goes up. But eventually we can try to get it much more detailed. I will tell you all that everyone who models has different preferences for how they do it, and I will really like to make the models as simple as possible and only add in the extra details when we think we need them. And the reason for that is if you start with all the details, it becomes really tricky to figure out why the model is doing what it's doing. And then you get scientists saying there's emergent results from the model. And it's like, well, you built it, you better be able to explain why it's happening. There is no emergent results in the computer. So I think we should start simple. And when we want to add the extra things in, we'll make sure that we add it in as we need it.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
All right, any last comments before we get to our next presentation, and then afterwards a break? One quick question, Ed. To what extent will these three models be integrated?
We can integrate them all. The Steve Morey's model will be I don't think I'm speaking out of turn here. I think it's going to be too detailed to integrate with this. So what I would do is take the output of Morey's model once he's settled on different runs and put it as input to our oyster model. So what that would look like would be asking Steve Morey to run this model and say, hey, what's the salinity and or temperature going to be at different parts of the bay under one water regime, under another water regime, and under a third water regime, something like that. And then we input those into the model.
Gotcha. Okay.
The other thing we can do with that is we can do stuff that Steve doesn't do. We can sort of short circuit it by saying, okay, we're not going to make Steve run another like days-long run of his model, but we are going to say, just let's assume that there's a really acute mortality event, because that's what we care about with oysters. The water quality is important for a bunch of other reasons too, but I'm in charge of the oyster part. So we can find different ways to get around that. Sandra, did I do that right?
Yes, that's fine. You're doing a really good job, Ed, better than I could. Obviously, this is your field. But yes, you're right about Steve's model. It will be extremely high resolution. And one aspect of his model, or one data set that his model is going to need that we don't currently have, is updated bathymetry, because that, of course, will affect the hydrodynamics. So, but we're working on getting that, hopefully this fall. I have a question for you, though. Another aspect that we've tasked Steve to address is the larval dispersal. Would you be able to integrate larval dispersal models into your model? And if so, at what kind of resolution?
Yeah, I didn't talk about that. It can be done. I've done it with other models. I haven't done it with this one. And with other models, I haven't had the luxury of working with a hydrodynamic modeler. So I use functions, mathematical functions, to approximate where the larvae wind up. But we can build that. We need a dispersal. I mean, the details are we need a dispersal matrix, probably eventually an array, but usually can do it with a matrix to say where do most of the larvae wind up. And if we want to have that different under different flow regimes, we can do that too.
Okay, yeah, he produces it, or has, as a probability distribution function. So, but that's between you and, that's the geek thing. You guys
yeah, the geek of that will be, we'll need to make my grid match up with his grid. and his grid is going to be so fine. So what we'll do is we'll aggregate his probability matrix down into a reduced size matrix and use that as the input to this model. And we can do that. And that's where I will be asking the cab to draw on maps and say, well, these are the bars that we want to make sure we're representing. That's going to define what the grid is that we eventually use.
Perfect. Thanks, Ed.
All right. Well, thank you, Ed. Really appreciate it. Good presentation. So we're going to turn to Laura Gesselbrock from TNC to give us her habitat suitability analysis predictive modeling. Laura, take her away.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm going to share my screen. I have some connectivity issues. I'm going to take my headset off first of all, because I think you'll get, can you hear me okay? Okay, great.
We can hear you.
Okay, wonderful. So if there's a slight pause, it's because my connectivity has gone down, and I'll just pull it right back up. So don't fret. Hopefully it'll be a good morning for connectivity. Can you all see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, great. So my name is Laura Gesselbrock. I'm with the Nature Conservancy Florida chapter. I'm based in Fort Lauderdale, and I've been working closely with Ann Birch and the rest of our oyster team, so to speak, up in the Pensacola Bay area. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the oyster habitat suitability model that we've developed for the Pensacola Bay system. And
You locked up, Laura, so hopefully your bandwidth will return.
If Ed says his very simple, okay? Can you hear me okay?
Now we can. Yeah, you kind of froze up for a minute.
Okay, I'm going to stop my video because I think that'll free up some bandwidth. So anyway, this is a very simple model. It's based on one that was done for Charlotte Harbor a few years ago. Dr. Matt Johnson out of Nova Southeastern University did the original model along with all the other folks listed here. And we've since adjusted it and as comments have come in. So not advancing for some reason.
Laura, if it doesn't work, I could run it and you could tell me when to shift it. Maybe that would free up bandwidth on your end if you think that would help.
I'm not sure why it's not advancing. I just did this the last 2 days and it worked fine. It might be better if you shared it or whoever else has the presentation handy. I'll stop sharing.
All right, let's see. Let me see here. Share screen. Got to get it out of the way of that. Here we go.
So while Jeff is getting that set up, just as you all, I'm sure know that every bay system in Florida is quite different, and Pensacola Bay is quite different from Apalachicola Bay. So, and just to, you can go to the next slide, Jeff, just to let you know that every these habitat suitability models can be built for every bay system, and they'll all be different based on not only the conditions of the bay, but also what data is available for that bay system. Okay, are you able to go to the next slide?
Yep.
It's not showing up on my screen, the next slide. Is it on everyone else's? No.
Do you see where it says project goal or not?
I don't see the second screen.
Huh.
Jeff, it's not on full screen and it's not shifting.
Okay, hold on a second. It says, I got to figure out where to get to that thing. Yeah, I see what's going on. I just can't get my cursor to go off the monitor.
Very strange. Never had this happen on a PowerPoint before. But anyway, I'll keep going on, and eventually the slides hopefully will catch up with us. So we have, if you can kind of see that second slide down, it's small, but essentially what I'm showing you there is we have some historical data for our Pensacola Bay system from the 1880s that shows that the upper lobes of the Pensacola Bay system, Escambia Bay, East Bay, and Blackwater Bay, had extensive oyster reefs in them. And for decades, this system was harvested. I saw pictures at one point in a hotel in Pensacola that was showing some of the images of harvested oysters, and they had these sloops just loaded with piles of oysters. So quite amazing. Go back one slide, Jeff, if you could.
What are you seeing right now? Does it say Project Goal?
I'm seeing slide 3. I need to be on slide 2.
Most of those areas are closed areas, aren't they?
So, the second image on the right there shows more contemporary oysters in green, and you can see the extent of oyster reef in the area is quite limited to what it was historically. And partly that, it's two main reasons I think are responsible for that. One is there were some very significant pollution spills into the system over a few decades, intermittent spills that wiped out the whole system of oysters and seagrass. And it was harder for the oysters to recover from that. An additional factor is there was a lot of sedimentation coming into this bay system. So in the deeper areas, especially, you can see it pretty clearly in East Bay, the deeper parts are just too much soft sediment. So you don't have oyster reef material that the spat can settle on in those areas. So you're kind of limited. You have sort of a very limited amount of reef in the system. And we don't even know if there's live oysters on those reefs at this time. Okay, I'm ready for this third slide. Thanks, Jeff. So the goal of our effort to develop this habitat suitability model was to, first of all, identify factors that made habitat suitable for oysters in the Pensacola Bay system, to look at what available spatial data was handy. So for each of the factors that we thought were potentially relevant. And then for those factors that had good spatial data and seemed particularly relevant, we scored them on a range from 0 to 1. Then we combined all these scores and divided it by the number of factors we ultimately used, which was 7, to get a overall habitat suitability score from 0 to 1. Okay, you can go on to the next slide. So these are all the factors we considered. You can see there's a huge long list. It turned out that some factors were, after we considered them in more detail, weren't as important as we thought. So those dropped out. And then other factors that were important, we didn't have good spatial data on them. So they dropped out for that reason. It's not to say they're not important. It's just either we need better data or we won't be able to use them currently. Next slide. So in green are the biological and environmental factors that we ended up putting into our model. There's 7 of them, and then in red, and those are in green. And then there's 2 in red that are more socioeconomic factors that we didn't include in the model, but you can add these on top of the model results to give you an idea of areas to avoid. You don't want to cite a restoration project or enhance fishing in areas where there's already some activities going on that would conflict with what you're trying to do. So we ended up with dissolved oxygen. And here it says average annual. We actually modified that later based on some information provided by Dr. Jane Caffrey of University of West Florida that we should really use minimum dissolved oxygen levels. So we did that to show where there's intermittent poor dissolved oxygen that could kill oyster reefs off. We also looked at salinity, average annual in the wet season. We looked at substrate types. Unfortunately, the substrate data for Pensacola Bay is kind of limited, but we used the best available. Presence of submerged aquatic vegetation. We didn't want to cite restoration projects or fishery enhancement projects where that exists, so we use that as a avoidance factor. We fortunately had some good information on larval distributions. This is based on a study done by Dr. Bill Arnold and colleagues, you know, we're so fortunate to have this, and we're fortunate to have oyster larvae still viable in the Pensacola Bay system. So that is a very important factor we were able to include. We also included the location of contemporary oyster reefs and also historic oyster habitat. We know you know, certainly the water quality over time has changed. I'll go into that a little bit more detail later. And also, you know, things are changing like precipitation regimes, you know, based on changing climate, also river flows, and even salinity levels into the bay. So all of that can change. So these habitat suitability models are not static, and they really should be updated maybe every 5 to 10 years to ensure that you're taking into account the best available information for that time period. Okay, next. So this is just another listing of the factors that were included. You can move on. This slide just shows you for the factors that were included, how we scored them. You know, some factors are just getting a 1, for example, if contemporary oyster beds are present, a 0 if they're absent. Similarly with historic. With dissolved oxygen, we went with the minimums, and we actually were able to break that down into 3 categories, 0, 0.5, and 1. So anything below a minimum dissolved oxygen level for the system over the years 2015 to as recently as the early part of 2020 got a 0. Anything between 2 and 4 milligrams per liter gets a 0.5, and anything above 4 milligrams per liter gets a 1. 1 being more being optimal for oyster survival. Again, some avoidances like seagrass, 0 if it's present, 1 if it's absent. Sediments, I mentioned we had some data. It's a little, you know, we just have mud, muddy sand. There's not a lot of hard bottom available in Pensacola Bay, except where there are some contemporary oyster reefs. Salinity, we used anything below 2 parts per thousand got a 0.5, and above 2 parts per thousand a 1. Recruitment, it was spatially variable, and it varied from 0 to 1 depending on the data that was available from this study that's listed there. And we didn't use the avoidances for more socioeconomic processes in the model, only an overlay at the end. Okay, next. So here are some assumptions. I mentioned the scoring from 0 to 1. If a area gets a 0 suitability score based on one of the factors, it does not mean it gets an overall 0 score for that location. It can still have a lower score based on some of the other factors. We used the best available data at the time of the study. The grid sizes we used were 25 by 25 meters. We clip it to the mouth of the Pensacola Bay system. And the main message here is that this model is not the end all be all of where you should cite something. It should be, as Ed said, it should start conversations. There should be field verification, but it gives you an idea of areas that are likely better to cite oyster reef restoration projects or do your fisheries enhancement projects, and areas that maybe you should avoid because the water quality just isn't right in those areas. Next. Some of the data we used in this project was based on data coming out of EPA. They did a probabilistic design study between the years 1995 and 2000. So this is like probably the best water quality study and sediment study available for the Pensacola Bay system, with the exception is that there is some more recent water quality data that can be used to enhance some of the factors, and I'll talk about that when we get to dissolved oxygen. Okay, next. So I'll just go through each of the factors we included. The green means good. And in this case of contemporary oyster beds, that's where they're located, where the green reefs are, and red is not present, not good, not as good. Next. Here's historic oyster beds. Green is where they existed. Red is where we did not have any data that they existed. Next. Here's dissolved oxygen. This is based on minimum dissolved oxygen. This is using the most recent data out of the EPA's water database. It's a very extensive database. I used 2015 to 2020 data because it was interesting. When I downloaded all this data, I had it as far back as it went. I had it back as far as the 1980s. So I did just a quick look at how that dissolved oxygen, bottom dissolved oxygen minimums changed over time. And over the decades, that red blob you see coming out of Escambia Bay, that expanded considerably over the decades that data was available. So something there is going on with the water quality, likely coming out of the Escambia River. Not sure exactly what it is. I haven't had a chance to analyze some of the water quality data more thoroughly. Next. So submerged aquatic vegetation is very hard to see here. They're just tiny little dots of where we have some freshwater grasses present. Historically, there was quite a bit of seagrass in Pensacola Bay, but water quality and sedimentation has changed considerably there, so we don't see that as much anymore. There might be small pockets, but there's not a lot of it. Next. This is sediments from that EPA study done by Macaulay and others. And so, the harder the sediment, the better it is for oysters to settle on. There's some sandy sediment actually in the middle of East Bay there and some other areas. Some more finer muds, which are areas you'd either want to avoid or have to deal with how you get the substrate to stay above those areas so that oyster reefs could settle on them. And then muddy sand, which is sort of intermediate. Again, it doesn't mean oysters couldn't ever grow there, but it's just you'd have to deal with some factors to make it more viable. Next. And here is salinity, spring and summer. It goes lower, of course, in the upper reaches where you have freshwater rivers coming in. So those areas are less likely to support oyster reefs that can sustain over time. The main areas of the bay are a little bit better from a salinity perspective. Things like salinity and DO and dissolved oxygen change quite a bit over the time of year, over years in general. There's variability, so it's hard to pinpoint exactly the best areas, but you can look at the areas that have persistently good water quality variables for oysters over time. Next. Then here's the larval recruitment data that came from Arnold et al.'s study, very helpful for our effort. He looked at, what we used here is where larvae settled, so recruits, and he just had provided point data in his study. We modeled, we interpolated that to give you an idea of where areas are probably getting enough larvae in the system that can sustain reefs. So better in places like East Bay and Pensacola Bay, not so much in the upper reaches and then the southern part of the Pensacola Bay system there. Next. So when we put all these factors together, as I mentioned, we take the factors that have been rated from 0 to 1, we add those up and divide them by the number of factors. So very, very simple model. And we get this picture, a spatially explicit picture or map that shows you areas in red that are less likely to be good for oysters, the reds and oranges, and the yellows and greens more likely to be good for oysters. Now, as you can see, there's, given where we know there's existing reefs, there's quite a lot of potential area that could be good for restored reefs and enhanced fishing reefs. This model result is based on bottom dissolved oxygen. If we were going to look at suitable areas for surface aquaculture, we'd want to include in the model the surface dissolved oxygen layer rather than the bottom dissolved oxygen layer, because it does change over time, and there are some differences in optimal areas. Next. This slide just kind of gives you an idea of how much of the bay system is not so good for oysters. That would be the red, which you can't even see because it's a very small area, a bar, and then the orange and yellow, less good for oysters likely, and then the green and dark green, better for oysters for survivability over time. So there's a lot of area to work with is the main message there. Next. And here's some of the overlays, some of the socioeconomic data that can be overlaid on the habitat suitability analysis. I just show 3 factors here. One is navigation channels. Of course, you don't want to be putting restoration or fishing opportunities in the way of those shipping channels. And you know, I don't know how precise the ships stay in that. It may be that there should be a buffer around that for a more realistic view of where to avoid areas for oyster reef restoration and fishing enhancement. The other factor is, and you can barely see them, they're little black blobs in the bay system here. Those are aquaculture lease areas, so fairly easy to avoid. And then I also put in here the areas that are prohibited for harvest currently. So, you know, you can see that some of those areas might be good for oysters. So those might be, or they might not. But the areas that are good for oysters, like in the Pensacola Bay, lower Pensacola Bay system, where you see green underneath the hatched area, you know, those might be really good areas for sort of larval refugia reefs, so that those can help to populate reefs in the open areas. So next. That pretty much covers it. Just the final points to mention: lots of potential area for restoration, fishing enhancement, and aquaculture. Bottom mapping. Oh, so the thing we will be doing starting very soon is we have a contract to get side scan sonar of existing, of the contemporary reefs done, as well as the lower part of Blackwater Bay and the lower part of the East River. So we'll have much better data to supplement this habitat suitability model. I already mentioned that each bay system although you can evaluate the same variables, you'll ultimately use probably a very unique set of variables for the bay system that you're working in. Socioeconomic factors can be added to this suitability analysis, but you have to be careful if you populate it too much with the socioeconomic variables. They may outweigh some of the ecological and biological values that are important for the survivability of oysters. And I mentioned that you can adjust some of the factors so you can really do a better job of pinpointing areas that would be appropriate for aquaculture. So that's what I have for you today, and happy to take any questions.
All right, anybody have any questions of Laura? Chad Hansen.
Yes, thank you. Hi, Laura. Chad Hansen with the Pew Charitable Trust. Thanks for the presentation and good information. Just can you clarify, when you're looking at the minimum dissolved oxygen and even the salinity, are those data points when that reached below those thresholds, or is that over a period of time, like 2 months, 1 month, number of days that was below those thresholds?
Yeah, so in the case of bottom dissolved oxygen, I just averaged, or no, excuse me, any of the sites that had bottom dissolved oxygen values that fell below those thresholds that I mentioned earlier. I think it's 2 milligrams per liter. Anything less than 2 got a 0. Anything between 2 and 4 milligrams per liter got a 0.5, and anything above 4 milligrams per liter got a 1. So they are averages, or excuse me, I keep saying averages. They are minimums. So it could change. It's not to say that those areas will always have bad dissolved oxygen levels, but it may be for long enough periods that it would kill oysters off. And I think the beauty of these habitat suitability models, you can get much more specific with the information you put into it. You can refine it and try and capture some of that variability better, which is helpful. I came across just the other day a habitat suitability model for Pensacola Bay from the 80s, which I didn't know existed, and it had a really good piece of advice in it for salinity mainly, and it was looking at the period, how frequently you get major freshwater events into the system that could affect specific areas, and that might be another good factor to add. So I don't think these habitat suitability models are ever done. They can keep being refined as you get people, more knowledgeable than I am about water quality, providing input on how best to characterize the system to capture that variability that makes a difference for oysters.
Laura, you might want to mention working with the watermen in Pensacola Bay too, with the maps and stuff as a data source.
Yes, so we recently provided our habitat suitability map to the oystermen to look at and provide their knowledge on where they thought good areas were from the past, and we captured all that data. Don't have it spatially identified yet. I don't have the copy of that map handy, but that'll be very helpful information to put into this as well.
Great. Any last questions before we take a break and then get into our discussions?
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to follow up if I could. This is Chad Hansen again. So like in theory and maybe practice, you could design this habitat suitability model to look at either monthly over a period of time that kind of match it up with the temperature and the salinity regimes that could provide you more fine-tuned, or you could break it down in a number of different ways, but really to kind of overlay that with the needs of the oyster population, with the oyster, what are those true vulnerabilities for the oysters, and you could get it more fine-tuned so you can see when those period of times you might, within your red zones, for instance, for minimum dissolved oxygen, there might be some periods of time whether it's those might be just like snapshots in time, and then those might be actually times when there's that minimum dissolved oxygen is not fatal to oysters, and so there might be some suitability some habitat in there that's suitable for oysters that they can survive, and vice versa in the green area. So I think you can, what I hear you saying is you can fine tune that to get more of that detailed information as you get further down into the data.
Absolutely. I think that's a good point. You know, in the minimum DO areas, is it ephemeral or is it something that seems to persist, you know, over time? That would be really good to refine the system in that way. So good point.
So Jeff, I'll just mention one other thing. Laura serves on the ABSI science team with Felicia and Sandra, and among other scientists. So we're thankful for that.
Right. Okay. Anything else? Well, thanks, Laura. Appreciate the good presentation. All right, we're going to take a break and then come back and sort of jump back into it. And why don't we come back at, let's see, 20 minutes till 11.
10:40.
Can you hear me okay, Maddie? Yeah. For some reason it sounds strange on my end, but you can hear me, yes?
No, I can hear you.
Okay.
Whoever has the phone number ending
Yeah.
in 100, could you just say who you are so we know?
You're being muted and unmuted.
Hey there, this is Gable with Senator Rubio's office.
Okay, sorry, who is it, please?
Josh Gable with Senator Rubio's office.
Cool,
Okay,
thank
great.
you.
Yep, no problem.
And welcome too. Maddie, you'll go ahead and, yeah, very good. All right, let's go ahead and continue on. So, you know, that we had a series of presentations that, you know, that were really good and took a lot of time, but I think they're important and they'll help us throughout the project. So our worksheet is the document that we'll be working on primarily for now on, and I'm going to put it up here and see what I can do here. So what I'm going to have to do in order to accomplish multiple goals in the virtual world is sort of shift between the document and not so that I can see people, because I'm not able to really do that very effectively, you know, with the screen sharing function of it. To do is sort of, you know, march through it and continue to revise primarily our strategies. Well, there are some proposals for changing some of the objectives. They're mostly tweaks and revisions, and hopefully we can do that fairly quickly. But what I wanted to tell you about was sort of the organization. So section 1 has the draft proposed strategies for our 5 goal areas. And in essence, that's the framework for our ecosystem-based management restoration plan, the very beginning of that. And so we have goal A, which is a healthy and productive bay ecosystem. Goal B is sustainable management of oyster resources. C is the thriving economy connected to the restored bay system and the importance of that. D is having an engaged stakeholder community and an informed public that support and are working, you know, to also helping for the restoration and maintenance of the bay system to continue. And E is having a science-informed ecosystem-based management restoration plan that's supported by the Apalachicola Bay system stakeholders. And so that it has longevity and there's monitoring and all that going on down the road. And then in section 2, there may be some strategies that we discussed that should be referred to some other program or entity outside of what we're doing. That's a parking place for those in the short term. And then we have section 3. Once we start getting deeper into this, some of our strategies, there may not be consensus on having those as a strategy. We're not going to lose those. We'll archive them. They'll be there in the worksheet, and ultimately there'll be an attachment to the plan so that it'll show all the strategies that were evaluated. So maybe we'll have 50 final strategies, but we may have evaluated 200. So they'll all be still there and accounted for. And then section 4 is our performance measures. These are sort of how do we forecast results, and these will be really important working with Ed's model and Steve's model. So, you know, to weigh potential outcomes, we want to make sure that we're achieving something specific, and that's our performance measures. And we'll discuss these at every meeting, go through them, revise them, You're not voting. All you're doing is acceptability rating these strategies for now. Once we have ones that have consensus and we run the scenarios using Ed's model, then the group will get a sense of whether those strategies are helpful and are actually achieving the goals that you hope to achieve. So that's kind of the layout of the document. And this is what we'll be working in from now on is this document. I appreciate those of you who did return your worksheets. That was helpful. Again, I understand though, we'll do this all live in the meeting, but it was just helpful to kind of get a little head start on what we hadn't covered yet. Now we've gone over goal A and goal B, pretty much that's been the focus of our meeting so far. A is a healthy and productive bay ecosystem. That's sort of the ecological piece of the puzzle. And I'd like to request that we not spend inordinate amounts of time tweaking language, but just, at least make sure that we agree conceptually, and there is some proposed changes, which I think are fine. We'll test those out, and then we'll proceed through on strategies. So when you see something underlined like this, ABSI project team, that's a proposed alternative that the team being Felicia and Sandra and myself and Bob and Maddie, between meetings are trying to work, not to change things, but to offer how that might be framed up or how we might combine a couple of these. Ultimately, we can't have hundreds of strategies. We're going to need to start combining these into sort of groups of strategies that make sense. And there is a lot of redundancy, and over time we will want to combine them into more discrete and specific strategies. And then once we have agreement on those, we'd want to lay out the action steps. What are the steps that have to happen? And then who would be the responsible entity for making sure that somebody does this? Some of this will go to FWC, some will go to FDACS, maybe some to DEP, some to the Water Management District, some to different things depending on what the recommendation is. The management components will primarily be FWC, and to the extent there's aquaculture or something related between the two to FDACS as well. And that's why we have everybody at the table so that they can be vetting these and shopping these. I did want to highlight the importance of each of you as a stakeholder, working with your constituent groups between meetings, informing people, letting them know. And we'll talk a little bit about that toward the end of the meeting in terms of what the group would like to see in the short term as far as additional public or information / participation. Okay, so what the team is proposing for A1, which says to develop restoration and management plans for the ABS, blah, blah, is to replace it with to develop restoration and adaptive management plans for the Apalachicola Bay system that allow rapid changes to the regulatory framework to address changes in environmental conditions, such as freshwater flow, water quality, habitat quality, all of those type of factors. So it's just another way of saying it that our scientists felt was just a better use of words. So I'll ask, does anybody have any, and I'm going to stop sharing for a second so I can see folks' reaction to this particular comment. All right. How do folks feel about that? Are folks good? I see some thumbs up. Does anybody have any issues with it? All right. Seeing none, we'll make that adjustment. All right. And let me go back to this. All right, the other proposed change from the team is that goal A6, our scientists felt is covered in goal B, which of course is the healthy, is the management piece of it, the sustainable management of the oyster resource. So we thought that this would belong to goal B as opposed to a goal A objective, which is to establish and implement policies and programs that provide the means to return a significant portion of the harvested oyster shell back into the system. So that's seemed like, for the team's perspective, a management component of that. So I'll ask for your thoughts on that. The folks support that change. It's basically just moving it.
Okay, I was just going to ask to clarify. This is Chad. So
Sure.
you're wanting, you're going to move that to goal B. It's not covered already in goal B with existing language, but you want to move that in its entirety into goal B. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I believe so. And if it is covered, if it is, then we'll sort of combine it. But that's the idea, yeah, to
Okay.
move it to goal B.
All right, I agree with that.
Okay. And I do want to remind folks that in the end, these are just buckets, and the whole plan works together. They're not silos, but just for thinking it through, it makes more sense. Okay, great.
Jeff, this is TJ.
Hey, TJ, go ahead.
Hey, the shucking houses around here, which largely the portion of the oysters they shuck are from Louisiana and Texas, but those oyster shells they sell in other places. You have to give them some type of incentive to be able to donate those back to the bay or somehow pay for them. I don't know, but there has to be an incentive to it. And there's mainly 3 oyster houses here, so I don't know what that would be, but they would have to have some kind of incentive to be willing to do it.
Okay, that's a good comment, TJ. And I think when we get to goal B, we'll make sure that's included with the whole idea of ensuring that we have some sort of a shell recycling or shell budget program, which I think is 3B. But I think the incentive, like you described, is really important, and we should include that. So good comment. Thank you. Okay, let me go back to the screen. In fact, I want to make a note of that so I don't forget. Sorry, give me 1 second. Incentive. Great. Okay. All right. Most of these others are very minor, and I indicated who proposed it. In this case, you can see Chad is the proposer of just changing the word target to desired, which I think is an excellent thought. Folks, are you good with that change? Does anybody have any problems with it? Everybody fine? Give me a couple thumbs at least. All right, I see thumbs, very good. All right, that one will be go. And then our strategies, yes.
Mike Norberg, I have a quick question. So the proposal is to change it from target to just a desired. Is that what that was?
No, to change the word, to delete the word desired and change it from desired to targeted.
Okay, great. Yep.
Okay.
And also on that, sorry, I'm talking over somebody else, but it said you have in there, the ABSI team proposes to move this from strategies to objectives.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
That's the other thing. Thanks, Chad. So what I should be doing is looking at my own notes where I highlighted it. Oh, here it is. Yes. We thought this might be an objective and not a strategy specifically, and thought, again, as long as it's covered. Does that make sense to you, Chad? Does everybody else agree with that?
Yeah.
That it really is more of an objective of which we could build specific strategies to accomplish. Anybody have any concern? Okay. Thanks, Chad. Next is, I wanted to point out that what we've done and what we will do between every meeting is to try our best to review and revise and edit and provide suggestions, which we will capture. We're not making any changes without shopping them with you. As you can see, that's why we have all the underlined and strike stuff. But also to try to combine things, because ultimately, a lot of these strategies are related and they should be combined into a single one with a set of action steps that would build out the strategy as opposed to a series of 10 strategies for one thing. So that's kind of what we tried to do for goal A. We didn't, get to that for C, D, and E. But so here's being proposed by 2 of our members. Chad was proposing adding into this increased productivity of the bay, blah, 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 some of which would be maintained as conservation areas. So that was Chad's suggestion. And then Roger suggested that we add as a possible substrate or mulch granite, because there's been some good success with granite, and there has been, and that's been documented. So that's another change. So I'll ask groups if they support adding in some of which would be maintained as sort of conservation areas first. Does that work for everybody?
Jeff, this is Mike. I would be a little more explicit on that if it's a group decision, and specify what you mean by conservation areas. Saying limited harvest conservation areas, no harvest conservation areas. I think that needs to be more clear, especially if it's going to be a consensus from the group.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mike. This is Chad. That's what I was going for, is a no harvest conservation area. We can call it whatever you want to call it, spawning reef or something like that. But the intent was to have areas that would be harvested and not harvested. And so I was just trying to use a general term there, but that was my intent, is to have areas, look at areas that would be not harvested, either permanently or for a period of time.
So, okay, so the clarification from Chad is that would be some of which would be retained as non-harvested, I'm just going to say protected areas, or, with the goal being to provide, brood stocks, fat production areas. Does that work for folks? Okay. And then adding granite as a potential substrate mulch. Everybody good with that? Again, it's just another list of type of things: fat on shell, artificial structure, whatever different things we would analyze as a group.
Have the areas already been kind of specified on what's going to be closed and for seed stock and?
No, Shannon. That's something that the group would do over time. First, we get agreement in the concept, and then we sit down and the group would discuss and work with Ed on the modeling to see what the likely results would be based on your locations. But no, you as a group would help decide that and make recommendations for where that would be and how much it would be. So we're just first agreeing to this in concept, and then we'll flesh it out. You may say, yeah, I agree with the concept, but in the end you say, no, I think this is terrible locations. We'll revise it and get it so you support it.
That's what I wanted to know.
Yep. Yeah, good question. Thank you for that. Okay, so Chad and Felicia, I think, made some comments here on this next one, which is basically using decision support tools to develop these areas so that they're, to pick the locations, and using our modeling and using our habitat suitability and all of that to make those kind of decisions. And of course, it would still be done in discussion with the group. And the water means experience in the water is, to me, I think to the team is super important in terms of shopping and vetting that with your experience and making sure that the science and the experience sort of, work together. So does that make sense to folks? Okay. This is one that our scientists, Felicia and I believe Sandra and Felicia, put together based on reviewing the notes and the discussions at the last meeting as another strategy. Develop criteria for sustaining specific reefs or reef systems that are damaged by environmental conditions or natural disasters that include, and actually this is one that CAB members proposed at the last meeting that I drafted up. I recall now, so I didn't have anybody's name there. So degree of damage and potential for recovery, approach for mitigating damage, physical repair, spat, supplement, all the different options, the periodicity or the frequency, or how often would it be done, annually or longer, specific timelines, whether it's 1 year, 3 years, whatever. It's really for this particular strategy is really for the restoration of the reef itself. That's based on, environmental damages, storms, whatever. And I think that's reflective of our discussions. So anybody have any comments on that, or everybody okay with it? Anybody not? Okay. I appreciate Mike being so responsive so that I can see him with his thumb up. That helps me to get a sense. So, right. Everybody good? Give me a couple thumbs. Come on. All right. Okay. Number 4 was moved from goal B to here. Again, I don't know that it's hugely important because it's there, but base all management decisions and monitoring requirements on high quality data. I think our scientists felt that was, part of this of goal A. It's related to goal B, but, anybody have any issue with that? Okay. All right. Number 7 is, this was provided by a combination that I sort of put together from Shannon Hartsfield and from Chad Hansen, because they were related comments. Ecosystem models that forecast future environmental conditions should include the effects of climate change, such as increasing sea level and ocean acidification, altered freshwater and salinity gradients, water temperature, storm intensity, rainfall, as well as availability of fresh water. I think Shannon had brought in the good point of, that's another, fresh water is a big part of that, an important piece that has to be analyzed. Are folks good with that as a strategy and concept? Anybody have any issues? All right. Then we'll go to goal B, and I'm hoping that we'll have some time to get into C and D since we haven't been able to get there yet.
Jeff.
Yeah.
This is Chad Taylor.
Hey, Chad.
Just good time to speak on this one. This is back to goal A. We were late in the game getting our comments in, so they aren't in here. I don't know exactly where this would go, but one of the observations is do these strategies take into account some of the issues that are outside of our defined area, specifically flows to the bay and the river, as regards the United States Army Corps of Engineers, their water control plan? We can recommend and strategize a lot of different things, but if we haven't taken into account the reality of so much of the water is controlled by the Corps, we may be operating in our own little bubble. So what we were thinking is first, do these strategies kind of fit the current plan? This is a water control plan for the Corps of Engineers. And then, what we might in the future try to impact them to do. We've requested in the past spring pulses to the bay, those kinds of things. There's also an attempt to make the Apalachicola river floodplain and bay a part of the Corps' authorization that would fit in there right along with the other authorized purposes, whether it's hydropower or whatever. So I think what we submitted a comment that's a little lengthy, or not necessarily lengthy, but do our strategy, I guess the way I would write that would be, do our strategies, or how can we make our strategies fit the reality of one of the major players in the basin that controls flows to the bay? That would be the Corps of Engineers. You could even include the Fish and Wildlife Service, since they do biological opinions, and the Corps supposedly takes those into account. Is this the realm this would go in? But, we want to have strategies that are realistic, and, that we recognize that so much of the freshwater flow is not controlled by Florida. And then we added to that a little bit under the stakeholder thing later on, that some of these users up there really are big influencers over the Corps and the operations of that water control manual. So that's under the stakeholder strategies. But anyway, that was the strategy, was to make this stuff relevant to what we have and what we may have in the future.
Chad, this is Steve. On the timing on this.
Wait a minute, Steve.
Okay.
Sorry. I'm going to respond first, and then I'm going to ask Sandra and or Felicia. So, Chad, I think the answer to the question is sure. We'll cap all the comments that you submitted to me last night. I will give to Bob to incorporate into the report as well. They'll be there. I think that could be a strategy when it was framed, and we'll certainly add it for consideration and discussion at subsequent meetings. But what I do want to say is that one of the things that we've made clear about this project all along is that we're completely aware of that situation and its impacts. And yes, it should be factored in, but I think our scientists are working with what we might call the existing conditions and what we know about those, and trying to make the best decisions based on that. So the answer is it would definitely take into consideration our existing water flow regimes, because that's what we have. And, yes, the rest of it needs to be looked at and evaluated. But Sandra or Felicia, would you like to weigh in as well?
Yeah, and I think Steve is probably going to say the same thing. But this decision support tools, which is kind of an overarching term that we use, embedded within that, and we will use decision support tools to guide some of these, drive some of these ultimate decisions on management. one of those tools is the hydrodynamic model. And Steve Lightman's part of that model is to look at how management decisions and climatic factors influence flow into the bay. And then Steve Maury's model will take those different flow scenarios and create his overall, bay salinity, temperature, current movement model. So we can use those integrated models to determine where might be a good place to do a certain thing under different scenarios. And so, yes, Chad, we are incorporating different flow regimes, different management scenarios, different climatic models into these models so that we're more informed about which places might be better or worse under different situations. I was going to say something else. I completely got derailed. So I'll let Steve take over from that.
Oh, I've got one comment too before Steve talks, if that's okay. The other things that we're going to have to consider, it's not just those things, and I'm hoping these are other things that Steve will be interested in incorporating into the model. But we've got, 2 other projects going on that are going to influence freshwater input into the region. And one of those is the Apalachicola Riverkeeper project, which, Georgia and Dan Tonsmeyer and Ken Jones are all involved in. And then there's another project that we just heard about at the last meeting, and that is the work that the Ducks Unlimited is doing, and that's going to also have an effect on water flow. So it's, there's some other gears in this project that need to be incorporated.
Right. Okay, Steve, did you want to say something before we continue?
Yeah, I wanted to point out that with the time frame in dealing with this is that in 2 years, the water control manual is for its 5-year review. And so it would be, if in the next year we can organize what we would like to see to get more water, that we can provide input into that process, and it's timed with when it's happening.
Okay, very good. So Chad, yeah.
So I think that's exactly the point in this suggested strategy, is that we at least recognize as a strategy that we need to be feeding this up to the powers that be they the Congress or the Corps or Fish and Wildlife or all these other players. That would seem to be a strategy that would be important under this category.
Okay.
So, Steve, thank you for that.
So Chad, we'll definitely add a strategy in, and when we send it out, you can look at it and tweak it as you see, and we'll discuss it at the next meeting again. So everybody fine with adding that in concept? We'll put together some verbiage based on what Chad said and what we heard from our scientist and Steve, who's also a scientist. But great. Okay, good. Thank you, Chad. That was a. Let me go back to the screen share, and get this back up here. Ding dong, there we go. All right, so first is really a series of just tweaks, I would say, proposed by us, the ABSI team, and it's just the underline where we add tourism, including tourism and aquaculture, and then that protection of, instead of the fishery, that protection of the habitat and the fishery it supports is supported by science, and we added stakeholder input, industry experience, and all that's already there, and equitable access and protection for the resource. So it's just adding a few words to kind of, I think, clarify, make this vision theme more consistent with what we as a group have talked about all along, which is all of those things. It's not, it's ecosystem services, it's fishery management, it's, all of it. All right, so anybody have any comments, or everybody okay with that change? I say yes.
Just trying to digest it a little bit.
Okay.
Can you go back to the slide?
Yeah, of course. Again, these have been provided, and you can bring them up at any meeting going forward, so they're not carved in stone. But yeah, here they are. It's just right here. We just added the word tourism. The fishery, the habitat, and the fishery it supports is all, no real change. And then including stakeholder input, as well as, industry expertise, et cetera.
I guess what I was envisioning is ever getting to a point where tourism is competing with the aquaculture, and in many other places, homeowners and property owners that rent out their property are opposed to aquaculture because of it impacts the vista. So I just concerned about having a plan, that might get sidetracked because tourism's in there, but.
Well, this is a vision statement. So when we talk about strategies, location and would be shopped as well. And those are what you just described are considerations and criteria to evaluate locations for our culture. So that would be, I think that would be covered inherently in our process. But the vision is that we have all of these things working together, and that then we address what the hangups would be in the process of proposing our strategies and objectives. Okay. And then the only other change here that has been proposed, and this is by Chad Hansen, is to add the word in B2 to develop an ABSI science-based oyster recovery and management plan. Just add the word recovery and to management plan. Anybody have any issues or concerns with that or support for it?
TJ has a point. Sorry, I was slow to get us off mute.
Okay, TJ, go ahead.
It was on A, on some wording on, here, scroll up just a little bit. On sustainably managed, is there some way we can also put in there about being enforced with the laws? I mean, some wording with, FWC and FDAX, just so we have that in wording, because they play a big part on the sustainability along with oarsmen as well. But we need that in wording, I think.
Okay. Maybe something like that, and I'll let our team work on this between meetings, but adding up there sustainably managed and adequately enforced or something like that.
If the law is not enforced, it's not going to last anyways. I know that managed sounds right, but I'd rather see that in wording.
Okay. Anybody have any issues with that in concept? And Felicia and Sandra will work on how to, make that right there.
Also, that enforcement comes up in, I think it's goal C.
Okay.
It's fairly prevalent there, but TJ, I'm happy to go back and check and make sure.
It's in goal B.
Is it B? Okay, sorry.
Yeah, it's in the strategies of goal B, but I think he's suggesting that it should be up in the vision as well.
Yeah, okay. We can do that.
Okay, so I'll just highlight it we can come back to as the right words you're thinking of. Anybody have any issues with the word recovery here that Chad Hansen's proposed? Okay, then I'm going to go to the strategies that are changing. So again, the team made an effort to combine some things into more discrete ones based on the discussions, and then there's some proposed changes and or additions here. This is what we discussed at the last meeting. All we've done here is, this is what we agreed to. I think Chad Hansen helped frame this up. But an FWC's rule, a well-defined and transparent rationale for why the closure is needed, prepared by the science team. That was from Georgia. And then limited was added by Chad. And then down below is the actual language of the rule for the closure, which is within the area, including St. George Sound, East Bay, which is basically, the FWC rule. And that was what we discussed at the last meeting. So this just reflects what we had discussed and agreed to. Anybody have any concerns, or everybody okay with that?
Yeah, if I have a comment, I would not specify a certain subparagraph within a rule. I would say within FWC Rule 68B-27 FAC. So strike the 0.013.
Okay. No, I suggest we take your advice on that. All right, everybody good with that? Which instead of having the actual, subparagraph, it's just the rule's good enough. There might be changes to the rule. There might be additional pieces that apply. I think Mike's articulating. Okay. All right. On strategy 2, which again was a strategy that we've already discussed, Chad has proposed some changes in verbiage. I think Chad's verbs are in strategic locations and using the best available scientific data and decision support tools. And I think our team added long-term and habitat. So develop long-term closed areas in strategic locations to provide habitat for year-round protection for broodstock and enhance spawning opportunities using the best available scientific data and decision support tools. And that kind of goes to what we were talking about previously too. So how does that work for folks? Anybody have any issues with that? Okay. Number 3, the only thing that was changed here is Chad proposed adding, and this goes to what TJ was saying as well, focus on developing a shell budget for maintaining reef habitat that will sustain healthy oyster populations and develop strategies. So maybe what I'll do here, TJ, and the team can revisit it, but just add and incentives to give that concept that you articulated a location for thinking through later. And incentives for increasing the funding for and reclamation of shells from local waterman restaurants. And then Chad suggested also aquaculture operations, or maybe there's opportunity there. So anybody have any comments or questions about any of that, or everybody okay with it? Some thumbs would be useful. All right, I see some, good. Okay, then let's go on to number 7. This was proposed by Chad. Oh, I'm sorry. Well, number 6, I'm not even going to test it. He's just correcting, develop protocols, not a protocol. There might be more than one. So that's really an editorial change. I'm going to make the assumption that that's not an issue for anybody on that. Number 7 was proposed by Chad again. Work with FDACs to ensure that oyster aquaculture practices and locations in the bay are compatible with the goals and strategies for restoration and management of the ecosystem and are compatible with a wild harvest fishery. And I think it also would go to Anita's point as well, in terms of, there are other social factors that would have to be considered in locations. I'll make a comment to that effect so we can visit that too. Anybody have any comments or questions or concerns? If not, is there support for that? Try to get through here a little bit. And Anita, I added that we'll make some note about the social factors that you had brought up to make sure that they're considered as well.
For clarification, Jeff, I'm not saying that tourism should dictate where aquaculture goes. I think that aquaculture should proceed and not be dictated by other issues. I'm trying to carve out a space so that we can get ahead of it. And I'm not saying tourism shouldn't have any bearing on it, but we've always been a working seafood town, which is our identity and the heritage and the cultural heritage. So I would like to not see it impacted by forces that in other areas like in Newport, where people refuse to let anything in front of their house. They don't want the oystermen there. They don't want the oystermen harvesting. They don't want traps and cages. And so it's become a big thing. And I'm thinking I don't quite know. It needs to be considered, certainly tourism needs to be considered, but it also needs to be a part of what we are and not do away with it because it might make somebody's vista look bad.
Right. It's the cultural component as well.
Right. It's what we are. And that's what we should be advertising to tourists, is more of the seafood side of it than
Yeah. So I think where that would really fit in, Anita, is when we get into the education and that part of the process where we talk about an informed and educated public that supports would support this because it's part of the culture and heritage of Franklin County, and make sure that we capture that. So I think those are great comments.
Okay.
And we'll get them in there. They're critical, actually. So
I was afraid you were looking at it the opposite way, and so I just wanted to clarify. I wasn't trying to wipe
yes.
out the landscape.
Yeah, no, I wasn't thinking of it the opposite way. I was thinking of it was that it is something to consider and, you know, be evaluated, not that it should be the limiting or the controlling factor. Okay.
And just as Chad, I just think, and further that, I think the word compatible or something similar, you know, kind of facilitates that. We're just trying to make sure everything's compatible, and we're considering those things.
Right. Good point. And we have that in there, compatible. So, okay. Well, I think we understand the concept. We'll make sure that it's incorporated in the right location in the document. I'm going to pop this down because I think that needs to be looked at. Okay. All right. Let's move on to goal C, which we have not really had an opportunity to discuss yet. So I'm glad that we're, you know, having some time to get into these. There were no changes proposed to the vision, the goal, the outcome, but we didn't have the strategies before. So these are.
Sorry, this is Mike. I don't mean to jump in. Can we roll back to, there was a bullet about enforcement, and I know there haven't been any changes. I think it'd probably be valuable to where whenever we reference enforcement, improving or whatever, we also acknowledge the application of appropriate penalties. So, you know, enforcement goes beyond just officers on the water. It also extends into the legal side, you know, of penalties actually occurring instead of.
Right. Okay. I'll make a note there. We'll probably want to shop with you some language, but for now we can make a note of it. Not sure why that number showed up there. There we go. Okay. That sounds good. Let's all right. Thanks, Mike. A good comment. All right. So some of these were strategies that we as the team initially proposed based on other projects, and then some were proposed by our members. I think there's some overlap, but if folks support these in common, in concept, then we will go back between meetings like we did on A and B and try to do some effort at combination and clarification. So first is monitor key economic indicators for changes over time based on restoration efforts to the bay system. So, you know, how are things changing now that if we're doing restoration, or do we see economic improvements, that kind of stuff, and having some sort of metrics and some sort of dashboard of which specific metrics are being reviewed and analyzed over time for improvements. That's the thought there. Anybody have any concerns or issues with that, or do we see some support? Okay. Next is work with existing partners to monitor and report on the economic benefits to a restored system, including the Chamber of Commerce, Apalachicola Regional Planning Council, and city and county staff. This was offered by Georgia. Again, working with existing partners is certainly critical and important. So how do folks feel about that? Anybody have any questions or comments or concerns? All right.
Jeff, I think that sounds good, but I would move it ahead of number 1.
Who was that, Sandra?
I'm sorry, this is Jenna.
Oh, sorry, Jenna. Okay, you'd like to see this as number 1? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And I'll be happy to do that. I do want to point out one thing, and just so we know, these are not prioritized at all, but I do understand the point, so that's fine. So how's that? Okay. Next is develop monitoring programs and metrics to measure output impacts of harvest for oyster bars. This was proposed by Anita. Go Questions, comments, concerns, support? Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Is that
Yeah,
Shannon?
yeah, you talk about the
Oh.
monitoring programs and the measuring. All this is stuff after the bay opens back up, or who's going to be measuring all this stuff? You know what I'm saying? If you want to monitor it and measure what the output is, but is that after the closure or during the closure?
So
it's pretty well it's going to close, right?
Yeah, Roger, this is Mike. I'm going to jump in real quick on that.
Okay.
So we have routine monitoring that goes on, whether it's through the harvest data, the trip ticket program, or it's our biologists out there doing standard monitoring. That's been going on, and that's going to continue going on. In the future, it's largely tied to legislative funding for that program. But I want to make sure it's very clear that we are continuing to monitor throughout a temporary suspension of harvest if the commission so chooses to implement that. Monitoring is an ongoing thing and will continue to be an ongoing thing.
Now that monitoring, you talk about that, the boats that go out there and put overboard and the boys go down there and just gather in one spot. And, seem like they go to the boys that go down and check and see how many oysters on the bottom that dive down. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, so the fisheries independent monitoring, which is similar to other fisheries where we have the biologists going out and doing statistically valid, robust sampling of populations to estimate the abundance.
Just okay to see what they're okay. Because I've seen them. I've been out there oystering when they'd come, but it seems to me like them boats they got a GPS reading. They'll come to one spot and then they'll go down there and check the areas because I've been oystering when they'd move me out of that same spot. And I just wonder if that's how they monitored how many oysters was down there or tried to figure out how many it was.
Yeah, I think that so they're I'm not 100% sure of their exact monitoring protocol, to be honest. That's our biology side, our FWRI research side. But I do know that they do random sampling throughout various bars throughout the bay. So it is, it's a sampling protocol they've developed. And I think, there's probably some potential room for conversations if in the future that protocol maybe needs to be looked at. I think that's
right. Well, that's what I was wondering, how they just come up with just what was down there. If it was, them people just going down up under the water and picking them up, because right. I'm gonna tell you, I watched them pick them up in the same spots. But when you tonging them oysters or gathering them up with tongs, there's a whole lot of difference. And then them boys just going down there and putting their hands down in the same spot every time.
So Roger, what we'll do is we'll make a note of that, and then when we come back to this, we can discuss. Mike can maybe give us some information on what the protocol is, and the cab and our water can talk about how that might be improved. Right, Mike?
Jeff, could I just, when you get a second?
Go ahead.
So Roger, what you said last time, you've said this before, and other people have said it. We took it to heart, and I'm working with some of the oystermen, Shannon, to try and expand what FWRI is doing. Now, what they're doing is for a specific reason. They're looking at not only the condition of the bars, but also how their restoration projects have been doing. So there's reasons why they're going back to the same place. But your point is well taken. And of course, there's only so many warm bodies to go around. So what we're planning on doing is adding to what FWRI is doing, and we'll put all that data in one box and share it. And so we're going to be doing, in conjunction with Shannon and hopefully some other watermen, to sample some other areas. So they have their restoration areas and what they're doing, and we'll supplement that with guidance from you guys so we can get a better picture of what's going on in the bay. We won't necessarily be using divers because, different tools for different jobs. What we want to do is have a quick look-see. We want to get a map of what's going on in the bay, and then we may do more focused stuff later. So just so you know, that's sort of in the works, and we did listen to you.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
can I make a suggestion? Chad Hansen here. I know you have a note there that FWC continues and Anita's word was developed, but maybe we just want to write ensure. So that way it's saying we just want to make sure that if they're existing and they're doing that type of monitoring already, then that's good. They need to continue. But if it's not included, the type of metrics, that they should make sure they include those in the program. So not necessarily getting into the details of what's being monitored and collected now, but making sure this is one thing that needs to be collected or monitored. So just changing develop to ensure.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Chad, because that monitoring program is tied to legislative funding.
Appreciate it.
All right, Chad, I went ahead and made the change there. Okay. Everybody good?
Mike, with the different protocols, maybe in the future, he's right, and I agree with Mr. Roger as well. And I think there needs to be a second opinion on testing how many bushels per acre. If it's a fishermen's association that has to go out and work together, there still needs to be two opinions. I don't think it should just be one. There's plenty of fishermen's associations. Shannon's right here beside me. I think Roger's right. So that's my opinion on it.
Okay, we'll add that in. Thanks, TJ. All right. Any other comments before I move on? All right. Next is was provided by Chad as well. Identify and monitor key economic indicators relevant to the commercial oyster fishery and associated industries in the region. So kind of keep track of that and make sure it's being monitored to help with the economic importance of the fishery and fisheries to Apalachicola Bay and Franklin County. Everybody good? Anybody comments? Okay. Support planning that, this is from Jenna, support planning that considers future conditions, climate change, sea level rise, reduced river flow, those type of things and their effects on the system.
And maybe just to specify that that's related to the key economic indicators.
Okay.
So Jeff, I think the intent here, as you guys between meetings, for the team to consolidate some of these overlapping strategies here, because there's some redundancies, but so there might be some combining and cleaning up. But you're just trying to get the overall sentiment of the group on what needs to be combined and grouped together. Is that what we're doing?
Yes, I think so. I mean, given this world that we're in here, trying to do it real time like we would in a meeting is more difficult. So we'll capture it, your comments and your thoughts and specific things. And then the team will work between the meetings to try to make those changes, and we'll get that out to you in advance. And if you have other comments or ideas, send them to us, and we'll make sure they get incorporated before we have our next meeting. Does that work for you, Chad? But it's very helpful when you provide this, when you have specific thoughts, because it does really help. So, okay. Next is Georgia. Work with watermen in the community to develop an oyster aquaculture brand for the system that emphasizes clean water and local connection. Pretty good with that. Anybody have any comments or clarifications?
I have a clarification, Jeff. This is Georgia.
Okay.
I don't think I use the word waterman because it's not a word that I typically use. So I'm sure it just kind of got wrapped into a couple of comments. But I mean, sometimes watermen can mean different things to different people. So specifically, oystermen or fishermen would be more accurate there, in my opinion. Are you sure that's my comment, though?
Well, it's always possible that I make mistakes. So without going back and looking, I can't be 100% sure, but I believe it is, but I could be wrong. I can look back later if you want me to.
We can make the change.
All good.
I made the change.
Yeah. Okay.
Right here.
Thank you.
Everybody good with that?
I would, Chad Hansen here, just to jump in on number 7, which is something I suggested including, can kind of be combined with number 6, but also I think it's working with the, not just the oystermen, but also, you know, the local agencies, the tourism council, development council, or whatever the appropriate local agencies and organizations might be, to kind of expand it. So it might be more than just the people on the water, but working to develop a community brand with, you know, those elements of the community. So we may want to be more inclusive there, or exclusive, I'm sorry.
All right, so I added here as a thought for us to look at, work with other community stakeholders as well.
And possibly combine 6 and 7.
Yeah, I made a note of that too. Combine with 6. Okay. Perfect. Everybody good?
Jeff, I had one comment. It's Felicia. On that one, I'm fine with combining those two things. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. It's not, I think in addition to working with, I really like the idea of coming up with, you know, a branding for this, but you could also get buy-in from some national groups that mark things as sustainably caught seafood or something like that. And that makes it, that gives it kind of a greater recognition on a larger scale. Not that you'd be able to necessarily provide oysters on a national level, but I think it's worth having that kind of certification.
Okay.
To me, this is Chad, that would be probably a separate strategy to try to achieve certification versus promoting and marketing.
Yeah.
And there is I just wanted to point out, and I don't know if we want to change it or separate it out, but the distinction between marketing and branding wild caught oysters versus aquaculture oysters or farm oysters. I don't know if we want to combine those or make those separate strategies. I don't have an opinion either way, but I just wanted to point out that we're combining those together.
Okay.
You're right, those might be separate strategies.
Yeah, and some of these are really even specific implementation steps. If you're talking about, you know, creating a marketing and branding for farm raised and or, you know, wild caught oysters, then steps are, you know, brand could be national recognition, certification. Those are just sub pieces. They're not specific strategies. I think they're components of the overall strategy that we can flesh out. I'll just put that here. I need some new glasses. Okay. Next is develop an oyster aquaculture industry that provides new economic opportunities. This is complementary to the wild harvest fishery. And then find resources for funding, education, business assistance, and capital to make the transition. And that was from Anita. Any comments or thoughts or questions about the strategy? Everybody okay with that? Anybody have any heartburn? All right.
Hey, this is Crash. Jeff, you just asked about heartburn. I'm getting heartburn.
Are you about what?
Well, I signed up, you know, for this to help rebuild Apalachicola Bay and the oyster populations in Apalachicola Bay, and if possible, an oyster fishery with the health of the bay, based on the keystone species of oysters. And we're spending time now talking about branding aquaculture oysters. If that's going to be part of our, you know, take up our time and our effort, and we're going to be so, you know, cast such a wide net that we're going to be doing all this stuff, I think it's going to really start interfering with our effectiveness of our primary goal.
Okay, well, the primary goal of this project, as articulated by, you know, the team and by agreement of the group, is that there are 5 areas, five key goal areas. And so this is one of the 5. They all go together. I don't know how much time we're going to spend on this, but this is first coming up with agreement that as a concept or that it's, helpful for C, which is, thinking about the economic components and importance of the bay system. And wild harvesting and aquaculture, I think, have always been considered a part of the process, as have ecosystem, the ecological components of it. So the plan that the group put together over the past 6 meetings includes, a healthy and productive bay ecosystem. It includes sustainable management of the oyster resource, which is the wild fishery and aquaculture, then the thriving economy, and engaged and informed stakeholder public, and then the science-based, ecosystem-based management restoration plan. So those are all part, the 5 goals of the overall piece.
Right, but where does marketing aquaculture oysters, some marketing campaigns, where does that fall in there?
Well, it's just part of what might be a strategy for the informing people about the importance of the economic component that oysters provide to Franklin County. I don't think it's, the main thing we're working on is A and B, which is the stuff is what you're talking about. We're talking about the ecological and the oyster fishery, but these are just sub pieces for education, for, ensuring the sustainability of it, getting support from, a broad range of stakeholders for the importance of it in the community. I think that was the purpose of it.
Hey, Jeff.
Yeah?
This is Anita. I saw it as a way to take pressure off the wild harvest. And that was when I was answering those questions, which 8 through 12 could definitely be combined, I think.
Yeah,
sure I answered that question so many times, but yeah, to me, it was trying to employ people, trying to keep it, our economy attached to seafood, trying to keep the bay, open to harvesting food, and taking the pressure off the wild caught oysters while we were restoring the beds. So, I mean, not all of it is a straight line, it's all interwoven, but just to have broadening our opportunities and still having a product that was grown in the bay.
Steve, you want to follow up?
Well, I mean, I'm all for aquaculture, and that's great, but I didn't volunteer my time to help develop aquaculture in Apalachicola Bay through this group. I donated my time to restore the wild oyster reefs in Apalachicola Bay and get Apalachicola healthy again, and first and foremost. And if there's ability to have an oyster fishery and commercial harvest of oysters based on the success of A, then that would be even better. But I didn't, I wasn't interested in developing marketing strategies for aquaculture, for farmed oysters, or anything for that matter. Marketing strategies to me should be left to some other entity or some other time and space, not change our focus or distract us from trying to restore the health of Apalachicola Bay.
So Steve, I have to say that I don't think what you said is inconsistent with what the plan is. I mean, I don't think there's any contemplation that we as a community advisory board in this particular part of the process are going to develop an actual marketing strategy. We're just going to say developing the marketing strategy is a good strategy that should be done. It would probably end up being referred to some other entity for like, that's when I talked about those type of strategies that need to be placed in another box. Maybe those end up there. But the primary focus of this is restoring the health of the bay, the oyster reef systems, the health of the bay, and trying to reestablish sustainable wild harvesting as well as aquaculture as a piece of it, is part of the plan, those 3 pieces. But we're not going to go into great detail on fleshing out these kind of plans, and we're putting together an ecosystem-based oyster management restoration plan primarily. So I don't think that what we're doing here is inconsistent with what you're trying to accomplish. I think we haven't talked about this yet, but it is part of it. The economic importance of it is an important piece for getting everybody on board. The citizens' education and knowledge about it and support for it is important to get people on board to support it all, both for funding and for long-term monitoring and success. So they're just pieces of it. The primary focus is A and B, and that's what you're talking about. And I don't think, So suffer a little more, went through it, and I think you'll be happy.
I said my piece.
All right. Does anybody else want to comment on that?
Yeah, this is Chad Hansen. I don't think they're incompatible. I think what we're doing, I get your frustration, Steve, but you know, the aquaculture can be a component of restoration if it's done in the right places and they're using sexually reproductive oysters where it's you know, a good thing to do, and that can contribute to the larval supply. And if we're talking about once this fishery reopens again, or as time goes on, a limited fishery, this is providing another opportunity to use the water for socioeconomic reasons. So I think those things are compatible with each other. But I agree that first part is the restoration and the ecosystem, getting that fixed up.
And I would have to say, speaking, you know, for the project team, that's, you know, totally the goal. The restoration of the bay is the goal. Okay, I'm just going to say the team will work on something to kind of combine those into a, you know, one or two that makes sense. Then Anita proposed to develop new markets for selling oysters to areas outside of Florida. Any comments on that?
That was mainly trying to get back to where we used to be, but I think that's way down the road. So that all can be combined, I think.
Yeah, and I think 14, Jenna's too. They're related to invest in branding of the Apalachicola Bay and Apalachicola oyster.
Yep.
Go ahead, Jenna.
No, I was going to say that could be combined up above and with some of the other suggestions.
Mm-hmm. All right, we'll take a shot at all this between, you know, now and the next meeting, but I think the point is there. Okay.
Yeah, the
yes,
Apalachicola oyster back in its day marketed itself and branded itself. It was on menus in San Francisco and Denver, Colorado, and New York City and Chicago, Apalachicola oyster. So, you know, without a good quality, healthy oyster fishery here, you know, trying to brand something that's not here anymore. I mean, it pretty much takes care of itself because it's a really high quality product.
Okay. Anybody else want to? Anybody else have any comments?
I guess this is Anita. I guess Steve, that's what I was trying to articulate, is getting back to what we had, the high quality oyster. It did brand itself, and it was known all over the country. So there was a comment earlier about marketing it, and I had the same thought. So yeah, it's that aspect of getting back to what we did have, and I don't quite know how to work that in there, but you're right.
Now, I can tell you at the end, as the bay declined over the past years, it got to the point where people said they did not want Apalachicola oysters because the oysters were small, they were poor quality, and so, you know, people didn't want them anymore.
So basically, I mean, the reality is that, you know, the restoration is key, because once that happens, then that we can move on from there. So I'll make a comment to that, a note to that effect. So I think that's a good comment. Next is about supporting efforts to maintain and revitalize the working waterfronts in Appalachian East Point. This is from Jenna. And if any of y'all want to say anything, the authors, feel free. But clearly that's the cultural heritage of Franklin County, right? Anybody have any comments on that?
Just a question maybe to Jenna. When you say support efforts, is that, you know, we're okay with what's going on, or do we want to actually increase those efforts or something along those lines?
I'm not sure what the answer is, Chad.
Okay. All right, because that's just vague to me.
No, yeah, it's getting back to the cultural heritage of this place and the importance of those areas, you know, for the economy and growing the seafood portion of our economy.
Okay. All right, thanks.
And again, you can't revitalize the working waterfront without first revitalizing the bay. So, If you revitalize the bay, the working waterfront will revitalize itself. It will follow the economy and it will follow the business and the production of the bay like it did in the past. The bay died, then the working waterfront died. So it pretty much takes care of itself if we take care of the bay.
Okay.
Yeah, Jeff.
Yes, sir, Roger.
Yeah, I agree with Steve now, because like I said, I had an oyster business, and all I dealt with was in Apalachicola oysters since 1982. I was there over 30 years. But I'm like Steve, if you get the oysters back, it'll bring itself back if you got something to sell. But if you ain't got anything to sell, you know, your hands is tied if that's what you deal with.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So I agree with Steve on you get the oyster back and it'll sell itself. Always has.
Okay.
I'd certainly agree with that too, Roger. This is Anita. I think what my sentiment would be is make sure that we don't zone it off the waterfront in some manner or exclude it from being there.
Right. Well, like I said, I've got a place over there. It's still sitting there, but I can't do nothing with it because I hadn't got any, you know, they ain't no oysters. Because if I had my rathers, that's what I'd be doing. Besides what, you know, but if you ain't got nothing to work with, you just kind of, you got to find something else to do.
Right. Yeah. So I think Anita's comment here is that, but let's make sure that we don't do anything that prevents us once we get it restored from being able to get back in business, because condos have taken over the waterfront and there's no more working waterfront left. That's the kind of things I think she's thinking about.
Right.
All right.
I just want to ask something if I can.
Yeah, go ahead.
This is Danita. Just can't we work with some of the aquaculture, you know, the farm-raised oysters in the meantime with restoring the waterfronts like in East Point and Appalachia? Because there are a bunch of leases over there and there's a lot of oysters coming out of there.
Yeah. Okay. We can put that down as a potential strategy.
Because I know, I mean, Lynn's and East Point, I sell them, you know, sometimes 20,000 oysters a week, and they go through them every week. And that's a lot of oysters just right there at that one place.
Yeah, well, I used to sell to Lynn before when she quit her shucking house and started that oyster bar. I started selling oysters to her when I had to quit my route because I couldn't get enough oysters for my route. And like I said, she does a good business over there, and I've eaten some of them oysters. They good, but you know, whenever she was selling wild caught oysters, and I sold her some this winter. But you know, a wild caught Apalachicola oyster is famous in itself. And if you had them, you could sell them, you know, even along with agricultural oysters, because there's, you know, like I said, if there's no oysters, you can't sell them. So she's got to deal with something, and I'm thankful that you got something you can sell her, so she can be in business.
Mm-hmm.
But Lynn's is a restaurant. Well, I don't know if restaurants fall into the category of working waterfront, but Lynn's is now a restaurant. She's not processing oysters. She's not wholesaling oysters. It's a restaurant.
Well, she did get her wholesale license back because I sold her some oysters just in February, but then the bay closed. But, you know, when it closed up, I just quit. But she did get her wholesale license back. But she'd quit them for a while because she didn't want to have to deal with the state. So.
Okay. Well, we've captured something here. We'll try to craft for your consideration. Okay, coordinate with local business community and government bodies such as city, county commission to ensure environmental impacts of industry and business within the system are minimized and conducive to a healthy ecosystem. This was Chad Hansen's thought. Comments, thoughts?
Mr. Jeff, this is Ricky Jones. I'd like to make a comment if I could.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Ricky.
These are all very valuable and they're very productive, but there's not been any place, I think, in Florida that's had as much protections done for it at the community and the government level as Apalachicola Bay. So when you get to some of these things, they sound really good, but there are individual people that own those individual pieces of property. And like when Roger's sitting, He's zone C1, so it has to be seafood related. And the county has kept it that way. It has not been changed. Most all property in East Point, unless there was something that was already there, if something new is built along the waterfront in East Point, it has to be seafood related. The reason Lynn was able to switch hers to a restaurant is because it's a seafood related restaurant. But it is a non-conforming use. If Hurricane Michael would have destroyed her building, she would not have anything she could build unless she's doing seafood. I just think it needs to be understood. I know this is a broad segment of people speaking in on this board, but again, Franklin County, our local governments have very limited growth management policies. We're a county of 12,000 people, and we have 10% of our land that has taxable value to it in the whole county.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Ricky. That's helpful information. Okay.
This is Chad here, Chad Hansen. Yeah, I appreciate that, Commissioner. And I think 16, 17, and 18 here can be somewhat connected or combined. They're kind of saying the same thing. And to Ricky's point, this is just making sure that those, because I live up in the county next to McCullough County, and they amend their land use plans and policies fairly regularly, so things can be changed. So this is working with the local communities and business leaders and commissioners, policymakers, to make sure we maintain that infrastructure and and compatibility with the fishery and the ecosystem. So that's making sure we're having those strong policies in place.
So we'll take a shot at sort of putting 16, 17, 18 together, because I think that makes a lot of sense. It's the same kind of thing. And the next one is just maintaining those strong policies that Ricky just spoke to, understanding that they're in place already, but let's make sure that they stay there so that when we restore the bay system and get things moving again, that we haven't moved too far down the road to allow the cultural heritage to be reestablished.
In the same light, Jeff, I think, and Ricky, correct me if I'm wrong, there has to be some flexibility for people who are stuck with property and aren't able to harvest wild oysters, wild-caught oysters. So you can't sit on it forever. But I think if we're aware of it, we need to make sure that it's not outlawed in the future. I know we have several struggles in Apalachicola because of things that have transitioned into more of a tourism economy, and you don't ever want to get to the point where you can't do both.
Okay. Anybody else have any comments on this? Ricky, go ahead. Ricky,
go ahead.
The
issue that we have is Florida is a tourism state, and they promote themselves that way. Franklin County now, because of limitations from our state and federal government, is a tourism economy. Again, only 10% of our land is on the tax rolls in the whole county. So, I mean, it can't be only about tourism, but the difficulty we're going to have, at least at the local government level, is when the bay is closed for a significant period of time, how many lawsuits must the county endure over property rights before we have to give way to some of these things that are enumerated here on this list? That's going to be a real issue.
And that might be a comment of maybe we could think about ways that the harvest and the access could still be maintained, but other things move forward too. In terms of purchasing a section of land or several areas that maintain, and then other things, maybe have more flexibility.
Okay. All right. Well, we have a lot of comments and thoughts and things to think through. I'm going to move on to the next one, see if we can get a little bit done with that before we sort of wrap up and talk about the next meeting. Going on to D is the stakeholder. Again, it's making sure the stakeholders in the community are engaged and supportive and informed about what's going on and what needs to happen. So one proposal here is to change the word development as innovation, which was proposed by Anita in the vision theme. Anybody have any concerns with that? All right. Then let's take a look at the strategies here. Again, we have a million of them. Again, they need to be combined just like we did, because it's just a listing that was given, you know, electronically, which I just compiled. Form an outreach and education subcommittee from the CAB that can spearhead development of educational materials as an outreach plan. Establish a CAB funding subcommittee that can identify and pursue potential funding mechanisms and resources to help with education and outreach. And I think those are, you know, kind of related. Anybody have any comments on those two? Again, these are going to need to be looked at. Develop the structure the CAB needs to help it evolve to some, you know, whatever it is, a nonprofit 501c3 or something with representation for local leadership, industry, harvester, state agency, and recognized by the state as the main entity overseeing the Bay Management Plan. I think that needs to be moved over to E, Anita, because that's really what that's about completely. But make a note of that. Oh. Anybody have any thoughts on that? Okay. Pursue funding to build the capacity, which is part of this too. So I'm going to say these would need to be combined. Okay. Any comments on any of that? Next is develop shell recycling program, find funding to provide staffing to recycle shell and provide incentives for shucking houses and restaurants. I think we have that over in B. So we'll take a look at that. Any thoughts on that? I mean, I think we talked about that previously under the management part. I'm looking to see if anybody has any comments. I don't see anything. So engage restaurant. Engage.
I was just. Sorry, Jeff. I think we do have it somewhere else, but in addition, just to find funding, maybe just identify funding mechanisms, something like that. So it's not maybe trying to find the cash, but try to figure out ways to develop that as a business model or something along those
lines. Okay.
And I will say that's part of ABSI. That's part of our ABSI outreach effort, is to look into that specifically.
All right. Thanks, Chad. Next is engage fishermen in the restoration of the bay and encourage future participation in restoration, such as shell recycling, shelling, relaying, all that sort of stuff. So really employing, you know, watermen, fishermen into the restoration efforts is to provide the economic component of that to keep people working until the restoration is to the point where harvesting can continue and probably beyond. Anybody have any comments on that?
Yeah, Jeff, I believe that's a pretty good point, because there ain't but a handful of people that's catching oysters right now, or was. And if they close this bay down, if you give that handful of people something to do, at least that's some that you ain't gonna be standing in the bread line.
Right.
You know, trying to find something to eat, because a lot of these oysters, they proud people, but they poor. So you need to you need to throw the dog a bone and give him something to chew on while they ain't got that to work. If that's any way to do that.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. It's an important point. Okay. Anybody else? And since I can't see everybody at once because of the screen sharing function, if I miss you, speak up, because I'm doing the best I can to scroll through 30 some odd pictures. All right. Build a program to educate harvesters on the importance of managing public oyster beds. Anita. Anybody have any comments or thoughts, concerns, anything?
We're trying to build a culture, you know, when the system's healthy and when the system's not healthy. Everybody needs to buy into its restoration. Try and keep people from harvesting areas that are closed.
Okay. Anybody have any comments? Next is work with FWC to develop and implement program to protect wild and leased oyster bars.
Jeff, I have a question on that. I don't understand what that is getting at, to be honest.
I'll let Anita answer that because it's her.
Okay.
I have no.
It's been so long ago. I'm not sure.
Okay, so the
context, so I just don't remember exactly.
Okay, so I think the fact that the least oyster bars is included. That's not just FWC now in this entire bullet. It's FWC FDAX.
Right.
Oh, I know what it was. Yeah, it was mainly, you know, aimed at theft. I think a lot of people, you know, when they talk about not wanting to do aquaculture, they talk about theft of equipment. It's, you know, you've got more to lose.
So basically, we're talking about enforcement here, having enforcement programs in place to, you know, better enforce, protect leases and whatever. Is that what you're getting to?
Yeah, and it might be redundant too.
Mike, what's your thought?
So that expansion on it makes a little bit more sense now. I think if from a BC perspective, so to implement a program to protect wild bars, I mean, that would fall under the management of those conservation areas that were already mentioned in an earlier goal, A or B. So I mean, essentially that if at face value, that's how I read it, is protection of wild bars would be in the sense of developing conservation areas. But now that you've kind of framed it more towards the enforcement against theft, it takes on a different connotation now. The way that,
yeah, I think that's where I was headed with it.
I think it needs to be moved over to goal B, strategy 8, Mike, which is, you know, the enforcement strategies that support restoration and all of that, poaching. It probably could be moved in there in some piece of it.
Hey, Jeff, I'd like to say something to Mike as well.
Sure.
Perpetual, this is TJ, by the way. Perpetual bottom leases are managed by FWC as well, not FDAX. So you guys do police those areas as well. But I think this is a serious issue. If we finally get to the time where this bay comes back, you guys are key on keeping it great. So anyway.
All right.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think it's you know, I mean, everybody's key on keeping it great. You know, less illegal harvest going on, self-policing, FWC being able to enforce and uphold stuff. But I think the leasing stuff, that's, I mean, our officers help with enforcement of DAX regulations to an extent. But those in perpetuity bars, those are, I mean, to my understanding, those are largely under DAX authority and purview.
They're managed by DAX, but the enforcement on the water, as far as theft and security, we would contact FWC, whether it's an aquaculture lease or an in perpetuity lease.
Yeah, and I think you know, in some situations also that also the local law enforcement. I know when we had issues with aquaculture theft in other parts of the state, you know, that is more, I believe the local sheriff got involved also, because it's theft of a private property essentially. or private product versus the wild product. But yes, Portia's comment of FWC providing support through law enforcement on the water is true.
Okay. All right. Well, I think it needs to be moved over to goal B though, and the FWC enforcement piece. Honor and reward businesses that demonstrate stewardship for the ABS resources. That could also be along TJ's point of incentives. Any thoughts on that, folks? All right. Decide key messaging for outreach and education plan related, identifying target audiences. Who are we trying to reach? That was from Georgia. And then also from Georgia's coordinated media plan on key topics, because I think these are related. And then from Georgia, collateral marketing materials published via print and electronic distribution. Probably these could be combined into something 9 through 11. Georgia, you want to say anything?
Agree they can be combined, and that's all part of the public awareness component, why oysters are important, why we need to take care of the bay, how the ecology and the economy are all connected. And so that's, you know, how we go about doing it.
Okay. Develop educational period. A lot of these are just, you know, I think the team's going to need to take some time and combine these into a much shorter list. But develop educational material that includes the vision and goals of the project that can be communicated. Develop an outreach plan to communicate project goals for a healthy system in the economy. Those are both by Chad. Support education training, alternative fisheries by Jenna. Partner on new and existing grant opportunities. Identify education programs beneficial to the industry, especially young entrants. Educate Franklin County youth on the history. These are all kind of related. Continue to expand efforts to educate the public. Plan to get updates out. Develop stakeholder and public surveys. Lessons learned. All of that. There's a lot of different things here. I think there's, you know, many of these can be combined into a much shorter, discrete list. But they're, you know, in general, what do folks think about the list and the ideas, and any thoughts or comments?
Jeff, this is Chad Taylor.
Okay, Chad.
We submitted some comments I think can be added on the next list, but one of the ones under this category, back up kind of to the vision part, is maybe we need to think about who we're defining stakeholders. And I think our point here gets to strategies that that might include those actions necessary to include out-of-state user groups. I mean, you look to the ACF stakeholders, and it's a group of stakeholders, but I'm kind of here representing that whole 56 governing board member group. But there are a lot of different stakeholders up there, from nuclear plants and hydropower plants and just you name it, Atlanta Regional Commission. So when we think about stakeholders, we best not just think about the ones here in the Apalachicola Basin. So we might want to, you know, think about those groups as we go forward. Another one that's very active right now that kind of fits in this category is the NOAA NIDIS dues process, the drought thing that's going on now that was held there at the Research Reserve. That's a really important component and a stakeholder, I think, that includes the feds. So I think we might want to include a strategy that gives us a way to identify who these stakeholders are and where they are and what their interests are.
Okay. I'll make a comment to that effect, but this is our definition of stakeholders for this project. Is, you know, it's in the agenda packet. I think it's on. I don't have the page handy, but it's there. I just popped it in there. But I'll make a note here, Chad, to make sure we identify the full range of stakeholders. All right. Anybody else have any comments?
Yeah, this is Chad Hansen. At the beginning, I had the first two bullets there were about having a subcommittee looking at funding mechanisms and looking at developing an outreach and education plan. And I think the intent there was to have those two subgroups, if that's the way we want to go, kind of flush out what those strategies are that we're laying out. So I don't know how we want to organize that accordingly, but I think that was the intent, is to help really flush out how you go about doing these things. And so I don't know if that will happen within the confines of this project or not, but that was sort of the intent, was to, rather than spend the time here trying to flush out how many pamphlets we'll need to get to who, have some other subset or some other folks really dive into that, taking in these strategies into account.
The project team will discuss it in terms of its how it would fit into the scope of the project, and if and come back with some recommendations. But if to that extent it may be something that gets pushed to some other thing, but we'll talk it over and see how it fits, and then report back on that, Chad.
That sounds good.
Thanks, so. Okay, I'm going to call it that we've done enough of going through this. So we didn't get to E, but take a look at it. Again, there were a lot of strategies proposed. I think the team will need to take the opportunity, just like we did it, is to kind of combine them into less. But they're in there in your agenda pack, in your strategies pack sheet. So it's a group. It's a set of strategies related to a fully funded and science-informed ecosystem-based management restoration plan supported by stakeholders and the longevity, et cetera, of that. So I'm not going to take the time to do that now, because I think we've got 15 minutes and I want to be done on time. And I think we should discuss sort of next steps, and also we discussed some time about making sure that we were able to at least touch on the public participation information part of this as we move through this. All right, well, first, is there anybody from the public who who would like an opportunity to talk? Anybody from the public who is not a member of the CAB that wants to say anything? Okay, I don't see anybody. Right now, it looks like everybody fits on my screen, so. All right, so since there's no public comment, then we will move into the next steps. So the next meeting is scheduled, and we'll put together a plan for some additional meetings, but as of now, our next meeting is scheduled for September the 9th. And some of the things that are there any specific presentations that we haven't had that we need? I mean, I think we can count on a model update from Ed and some discussion about a strategy for deeper dives for those who want to. Is there anything else that we need in terms of presentations for the next meeting that folks are?
Jeff, it's Anita.
Yes, Anita.
I know we were going to talk, I wasn't sure where this is on the end of the agenda, but we were going to talk about public education. I feel like we're really...
We're going to, yeah.
Okay.
I mentioned that the public participation education piece, but what I wanted to get first is just see if there's any presentations, and then it's one of the pieces we'll talk about in just a couple seconds.
Okay.
No problem. And is there any other kind of information presentations that folks feel is needed at this juncture in the process?
This is Chad Hansen. I don't know if it's needed, but at some point it would be, I think the intent would be to look at the shell recycling programs, and if the project team would be ready, either one of the next coming meetings, to kind of present a summary of shell recycling programs. That might be just something useful for the group.
Okay.
I don't think there's any sense of urgency, but I think that would be.
Okay, good one. That's a good one. We'll definitely put it on in the planning piece of it, finding the right people, et cetera. Anything else that we think is needed?
Jeff, this is Chad. I know y'all keep hearing me as an upper basin person. Rather than listen to me, would it help if, say, the executive manager of the ACF stakeholders came down and we do presentations all over the ACF basin to give you a little sense of who that is and what they're trying to do as far as how that may or may not impact what we're doing down here, and how what we do here might engage them up there rather than listening to me harp on it. Mark Masters is the executive manager. We have several folks that could probably be willing to come down and do a short presentation like you've been listening to, or either do it from, well, since we're doing it on Zoom, Mark could do it from his office in Albany. I just wonder if there's that interest in that, because it plays such an important part of what we're trying to do.
Okay. Is that interesting to folks? Would you like to have some presentation along that line? And of course, Felicia and Sandra can work out the details, but is that something folks are interested in? Okay. All right, we'll put it in the mix, Chad. Felicia and Sandra will work on, what they think as well are the next sets, but I certainly think it's something that we could work into the schedule. Okay. Okay, well, then let's go ahead and talk about sort of where we are and what might be effective public participation at this phase in the project. We had come up a couple times previously. I think Georgia had brought it up and Anita as well. Go ahead. What do y'all think?
Well, I feel like I've been trying to impart some of what we're doing at city commission meetings, but it really is not the best venue because there's so much business being done. But I feel like we need to bring the public along with us as we're developing this, letting them know the basics, who's on the committee, just constantly reminding them. I feel like we should have something out there at least once a month about what's going on and what the status is. We're just operating in a vacuum until we do. And I know it's not a lot that can be said, but just starting the communication. And Chad had a great idea, and I'd be happy to serve on it as a education subcommittee. That might be a way to accomplish some of it, because people need to know.
Okay.
It's almost 8 months now.
Yeah.
All right. Georgia, would you like to say something?
I think Anita said it fine. It's part of the who we are and what we're doing. I've spent, in talking to the community just in terms of what's going on with the FWC commission meeting coming up next week. I get the question of, well, how's that FSU project going on? What's going on with that? Didn't they get a bunch of money? And so that's an opportunity to again explain who we are and what we're doing. And I can do it. We should all be doing it as individuals, but I think a broader push would be really helpful, or some tools, one page or something to help again keep the word out in the community of what it is we're trying to accomplish and why we all are sitting around a computer for 4 hours working together, because we all want to do the right thing and get this day back to where it needs to be.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sandra, did you want to say anything? Go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with you. We have not done a good job of that. We've been focused on the CAB, we've worked on the website, but we have not done a good job of reaching out to the public, and that needs to change. This is kind of Felicia's thing. She's in charge of outreach and community engagement, but I think we would both, and she can speak for herself, but welcome suggestions on how to do that. So Georgia and Anita, an idea of an education subcommittee, I think is a good one. If you have, the time and energy to do it, but definitely something we need to address.
Yeah, and I can connect with you guys. I think Chad was also in the mix for that. I'll just reach out to you guys after this meeting, probably early next week, and see what you have in mind.
Alicia, which Chad did you mean?
Oh, I'm sorry, Chad Hansen.
Yeah, Jeff, I'd like to add to that if I could, when it's appropriate.
On the education piece?
Well, I think it's that, I think a good example is we at the county level have hired Ken Jones for the Riparian County Stakeholder Coalition that I'm sitting here representing the 6 county commissions, Board of County Commissions. And what I was trying to figure out the best way to get him involved in this, because he's got a career in the Water Management District and at Atkins and Private Enterprise, and he's just got a background in education and estuarine management, resource management. And so we have appointed him as my alternate. I'm concerned that the only way he can speak if we're both present is in the 3 minutes at the end of the public session, if I understand the rules. And so some of the public restrictions they're not exactly what I would say would encourage people to want to become involved. I almost hate to bring up the Jack Rudlow's name because I know he's such a critic of practically, everybody's a target, but I think we've got to become somehow more user friendly. Ken has much more to add than I do in the scientific realm. I'm a social scientist. So I think I know you're an excellent facilitator because you can take people like me and cut us off and shut us up and move us along. But we've got to give more opportunity for more people to speak and engage than just go to the website and surf around, or either speak for 3 minutes at the very end of the meeting. Maybe there needs to be opportunity throughout this 4 hours for public comment, maybe at the end of each session or something like that, because it's just impossible to jump in after something like this for 3 minutes at the tail end. So I think we need to work on that. I'm kind of with Georgia and Anita on that one. I don't know the answers, but I know y'all do.
Okay. Anybody else have any comments?
Just Chad Hansen here. Just jumping off that. So I think maybe, I don't know if it's like maybe having an informal subset of people like Felicia mentioned, reaching out to us, and sound like there's some names have been identified. If anybody else wants to join in, I guess I would say chime in, but to help the project team design a way to relate to the community and who needs to hear it, and what kind of things they need to hear about this project, and trying to figure out a way to keep that ongoing. So seems like having like a subgroup of folks get on the phone in the next week or 2 or 3, or to help put that together might be a way to go.
Yeah, we have that, Chad. It's Felicia's going to get with you and Georgia and Anita and sort of set up a time to talk and come up with some strategies and thoughts. And if there's other members of the CAB that want to be part of a education subcommittee, they should let themselves be known as well. Okay, well, I understand your Chad Taylor's frustration, but I could tell you from having done this a million years, the reason we have a community stakeholder advisory board is that we selected representatives of many, many constituencies who represent their larger interests. And there's lots of people with lots of information, and the public participation part that they're going to be working on our subcommittee when it's ripe to have public meetings, which it isn't yet with COVID, but we can certainly do some web stuff, is that if everybody who wants to talk talks, then it's not a productive deal. So that's why we have representatives, and that's why we limit that to that. I do understand the frustration, but if we want to move this down the field, that's what we have, is we have representatives of all the interests. We have 25, 28 people here. They have to bring those voices to the table through themselves between meetings. I'll talk it over with the team in terms of perhaps multiple entry points for public comment. It does make sense, but and that's not a problem. That's easy to do, but the discussions are really at the table when the community advisory board is there. That's how, if we tried to do all these goals and we had 100 people with different ideas, not representative people, that would make the process really not efficient. But I think we can accommodate additional public comment throughout the meeting. I'll talk it over with the team on how we might be able to do that. And multiple point, having different opportunities after each segment might be an approach. And I've done it with some groups in the past. It's just a little hard to get this group moving down the road because of the fact that we can't meet face to face, and we haven't even gone through all 5 goals yet. So and normally you at least get agreement on your goal structure before you shop it, to the public, so that you have some continuity and something for them to look at. So it's a little bit sluggish because, again, 4-hour meetings and trying to do it in this kind of virtual world. But we'll work on it, Chad. Sandra?
Yeah, I just say a quick comment. Chad, if you think that your alternate has, valuable contributions, one suggestion might be to switch out. Every other meeting, maybe one of you sit in the background and the other one be the primary. It's just one idea.
Yeah, that's certainly possible. But okay.
Well, if that's allowed, I would certainly be happy to do that. I probably need to study the protocol better. But there may be some value in that, because he's much more articulate than I am on a lot of the scientific and the, that kind of stuff. So that's okay? Then I would become a member of the public from the comment perspective, or if you mix it up along the way, that would work. That's a good idea.
Well, I mean, there's a couple ways to approach it. If you thought you would rather him be the member for ACF, then that's something you could just do, and you could become the alternate, or you could keep yourself the member and the alternate. But why don't we discuss this offline and come up with something that works for you?
Great.
Okay. I mean, yeah. I mean,
and this
Mike, the example is Mike Norberg is here, and Jim Estes is the appointed member, but Mike will be here at many meetings, and at some point Jim will be retired and Mike will be the member. But when Jim's at the table, Mike sort of sits in the public just like everybody else. So it's really the same kind of deal. Who wanted to say something? I want to kind of wrap.
Sorry, this is Chad. I just wanted to point out, yeah, and in the chat, I don't know if you guys have seen the chat, but there's a suggestion, take a few minutes to talk about the FWC meeting next week. Just wanted to point that out.
Oh, well.
I think that, Mike, did you want to say anything about that? Would that be okay?
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that people were, and I feel like everybody's familiar with the proposal. We'll be taking our commission next, was it Wednesday, I believe? The 22nd, whatever day that is. I'm sorry, my days are all getting mixed up now. So it's a virtual meeting. Meeting begins at 9:00 Eastern time. And there'll be an opportunity for public comments for any of the agenda topics. But specifically, there is a proposal to temporarily suspend wild oyster harvest from Apalachicola Bay. That's been a big ask from a lot of the community and industry that we've worked with over the last 8 years. And we are have that opportunity to take that step. And during that time, there's a large scale restoration. There's this work going on through ABSI that can help promote and enhance the opportunity for oysters to recover. So that meeting will be held virtually, and I encourage anybody to call in and provide public feedback. Our commissioners are very receptive to any kind of feedback from the public.
Okay, and that's next Wednesday. It's the commission meeting. So if you're interested, go online, look at the website, figure out how you can make comments and go from there. But we're not going to discuss in any way, shape, or form the pros and cons of the proposal. Only the fact that it's information that the meeting's happening. I want to make that real clear. Go ahead, Julie.
Thank you, Jeff. I feel like I was just shut down. You were expecting me to say something controversial, perhaps.
No, I didn't even know you were ready to speak. I wanted to make that comment before anybody spoke, but go ahead, Georgia.
I would simply add that many of us are in full support of suspending wild oyster harvesting. I mean, we spent a couple meetings talking about that extensively. I was just going to add there's an easy link on the Riverkeeper website with information in it that does lead you to FWC. Not that I'm trying to steal Mike's website. The information's out there. You all know Riverkeeper is fully in support, so we have compiled some materials that you can walk there. And many of us do plan on speaking support at the meeting, Mike, just so you're aware.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing that up, Georgia. There's our website has the actual presentation that we're going to be giving to the commission. It has all the supporting documents for the proposal. So I encourage you, if you haven't done so, take a look at that stuff. And if Georgia if they have a link easier. Our website oftentimes, there's a lot of information on it, so sometimes it can be difficult to find one thing that you're looking for. But there's also, along the top, you can get down, you can find a link directly to the commission meeting agendas, past commission meeting agendas and documents. So that stuff is available online. I encourage everybody to take a look at it ahead of time.
Okay. Anybody else have anything on that? Okay. Maddie, I think you had some little survey thing you wanted to do, evaluation type thing?
Yeah, just like last time, for those of you that were able to attend, it'll just be a quick poll for you to click through, and I'll have 2 questions in the chat. Basically, what you think works well with doing Zoom meetings, and also what could also be improved. So you can feel free to send me your answers privately, or to Jeff or Bob or Felicia or Sandra if you don't want to send to the group. And I also want to say thank you everyone for being patient and doing these, because I know it's tricky and I know it's hard and weird, and we're making it work. So I appreciate it. And here's the poll. I can launch it. Okay. Oh, and I'll submit the questions. Oh, and for anyone that called in, I'll just send you the questions through email, since you can't see it.
I'm sorry, Maddie, you said anybody called in?
Yeah, so like John, Paul, Thurman had to leave early.
You're breaking up kind of.
Ooh, my connection. My connection's a little shaky. I'll just email
Yeah, your
out.
bandwidth isn't doing too well, so.
Yeah, sorry.
There, now. Okay. Well, anyway, while you're doing that, appreciate everybody's good hard work and, tolerating the virtual methodology that we have to use. But it's still, I think we're advancing it here. So I appreciate your work.
So Maddie, can one do all 5 or 8 of the questions? It's only displaying the first question. Does that mean?
No, it looks like everyone's seeing them.
Okay.
Yeah.
You have to scroll it, Bob. They're all there. You just have to scroll them.
Ah, sorry.
And since we can't really see Maddie, let us know.
Yeah, I will.
And I see that somebody.
Jeff, I have a question.
Go ahead. 1 second. I see that somebody put up the link to the commission meeting. So if you want to see that in the chat, you can get the link. Go ahead, Chad.
Was the intent between the next meeting, you're going to do a lot of consolidation and refinement of the strategies that we just went through, and then are you going to send that back out ahead of time for us to edit and send back, or just be prepared to talk about it next time? Like before this meeting, we had the homework to do. Are we going to have that similar type of homework do you anticipate, or should we just come prepared to talk about it at the next meeting?
I think come prepared to talk about it the next meeting. I'm a little reluctant to send homework since the response rate was extremely low. However, if you have specific things you want to offer, I'd be happy to, incorporate those before the final distribution into the next meeting so they'd be visible. But I'm not going to make it a homework. I'm going to say if it's something you want to do, feel free to.
So we'll do our best to combine.
Yeah. I was just
respond.
So Chad, you're having a little bit of difficulty. You're kind of freezing up, so it's a little hard to hear some of it. So go ahead, try again.
Okay, yeah. So I was wanting to react to the combined. After you guys do the work, I'll take a look at it, and if I have any, thoughts, I can maybe send you edits ahead of time so that you're prepared for those if I have the chance. I was just wondering what you're expecting from us on that end.
That would be the expectation. It's not a specific homework, but if you can do that and would do it, we'd be happy to include it so that it would make it easier for everybody to see it in advance. Just let us know either way, Chad, what you're going to do. If you'd like, we'll make sure you get it in plenty of time so that you can if you want to take a shot at it, feel free.
So the other Chad wants to be sure you include our comments in that next thing, even though we were late, unless you need to penalize us for that.
No, there's no penalty. We'll add them in. I just couldn't do it last night.
Yeah, I understand. I know.
I decided
didn't expect it. Just didn't want you to forget.
I've not forgotten, and we'll pop those all in. They'll all be in this summary report that comes out from this meeting, Chad. But appreciate you doing them. I mean, they're good comments. It's just it was a little too late for me to make any changes. Are we done with the survey, Maddie? I can't tell.
Everybody answered, so thank you. And if anyone has any more comments, you can still chat them to me. I'll be on for a little bit longer. But yeah, we're good.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Really appreciate your work, and we look forward to seeing you all at our next meeting.
Hey, Jeff, before we log off, thank you for putting that link in the chat box. And I also wanted, I failed to mention that we have received a number of public comments. Our commissioners have received them, through that deadline. I wanted to acknowledge that those have been received and have been read in our commissioners' hands. So thank you for anybody who had an opportunity to do that and still are encouraged to call into the commission meetings. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. Anybody else have anything they want to say before we adjourn? Again, thank you all, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
Thanks.
Stay safe.
All right. Thank you.